I've always loved camping. Ever since I was a kid, the woods felt like a second home. My friends and I used to hike in the summer, pitch tents under the stars, and make memories around the campfire. This time was supposed to be like any other, just me, my gear, and the wilderness. But things took a turn, one I never expected. Started out like any other weekend. I had everything packed the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I was heading to a quiet spot in the mountains, a place I had been to a dozen times. The weather forecast promised clear skies, so I wasn't concerned. I made my way up to the trailhead early in the morning, leaving behind the noise of the city. The air felt fresh and crisp as I started the hike. The path was familiar, rocky terrain with trees towering overhead. The woods were thick, but not enough to block the sunlight completely. I could hear the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. It was peaceful. I kept my pace steady, enjoying the solitude, letting my mind wander as I walked deeper into the woods. The first few hours were uneventful. The hike took me higher into the mountains, and as the day wore on, the temperature dropped. By the time I reached my campsite, it was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The clearing where I planned to camp was perfect, just like every other time. There was a small creek nearby, its sound calming as I set up my tent. I didn't bother starting a fire yet. I wanted to wait until nightfall. Instead, I made a quick meal and sat by the creek for a while. The peace of the woods was something I couldn't get enough of. For a moment, I thought how lucky I was to have this place to myself. As the evening rolled in, the shadows in the trees grew long, and the temperature dropped. I finally started the fire, the crackling flames bringing warmth. The light danced on the surrounding trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. But it was nothing to be afraid of, just nature doing its thing. That's when I noticed something odd. It was the way the firelight flickered in the distance. For a second, I thought I saw a figure moving between the trees. I blinked and the shape was gone. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. After all, I was in the woods, and the light from the fire can make things look strange. But the feeling didn't go away. It nagged at me like I wasn't alone. The breeze shifted, and I heard a rustling in the bushes. I looked around, my heart rate quickening, but there was nothing there, just the dark woods surrounding me. I tried to push the thought from my mind and focused on the fire. The sound of the crackling would filling my ears. Night had fully fallen, and the only light was from the fire. The sky was clear, and I could see stars above, shining through the gaps in the trees. But despite the beauty of the night, a sense of unease settled over me. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, footsteps that weren't mine. It was as though someone was walking just out of sight, always moving but never fully revealing themselves. I convinced myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or some other creature moving through the woods. But the noises didn't stop. They continued for hours, getting closer, then farther away, then closer again. It was starting to feel too deliberate, like someone or something was circling me. I checked my phone for any signal. Nothing. Of course, there was nothing. I had known when I planned this trip that the signal would be spotty at best, but it didn't make me feel any better. I stood up from my camp chair, my eyes scanning the edge of the clearing, the firelight flickering wildly as if reacting to something unseen. The noise came again, a snap of a twig, followed by a heavy rustle of leaves. I turned sharply, my heart racing. There, in the darkness, a figure appeared, just on the edge of the firelight. It was tall and thin, almost like a silhouette, but I couldn't make out any features. My pulse quickened as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching. I wasn't sure how long I stood frozen like that, but I finally broke the trance and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I turned it on, aiming it toward the figure, but the beam didn't reach that far. The figure was gone. Just like that. I called out, but no answer came. There was only the sound of the wind and the crackle of the fire. I wasn't about to stick around. My instincts kicked in, telling me to pack up and get out, but I was too far from the trailhead. It would be a dangerous hike to try and leave now, especially with night fully settled in. So, I decided to stay put for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every little noise made my heart race. Every shadow in the woods seemed to shift, and I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks or something real lurking in the dark. The firelight seemed to grow dimmer, and I kept adding logs, trying to keep the flames strong. I could feel my body tense, muscles tight with anxiety, but I didn't dare let my guard down. As the night wore on, the noises stopped. The woods grew eerily quiet. I felt the tension in my chest ease just a little, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat up through the rest of the night, wide-eyed and vigilant, watching every shadow, listening for any sound. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the clearing. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest as the light returned to the world, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. I quickly packed up my gear, eager to leave this place behind. As I made my way back down the trail, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps. The woods seemed so peaceful now in the daylight. The birds were chirping again, and the breeze was gentle. But I knew what I had felt the night before. There was something out there in the woods, something I couldn't explain. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that I had made it out, but frustration that I couldn't explain what had happened. I'd been in these woods countless times before, and nothing like this had ever happened. But there was one thing I couldn't shake, one thing that stayed with me even after I left. As I passed the area where I had camped, I looked back one last time, and I swear I saw a flash of movement between the trees. It was quick, but I saw it. Just a glimpse of a figure, like the one I'd seen the night before. I didn't wait around to see more. I turned and walked away, determined to put this whole experience behind me. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The woods that had always felt like home no longer felt safe. And no matter how much time passed, I couldn't forget the feeling that someone or something was watching. So I've never gone back. It's been years since that trip, and I've avoided camping in those mountains. I still love the outdoors, but I choose my spots carefully now. The woods have a way of hiding things that are better left unexplained. Maybe it was just my imagination, maybe not, but I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight, always just beyond the light of the fire. And maybe that's what scares me the most, that whatever it was is still out there, waiting for the next person to camp in its territory. I wasn't sure why I decided to go camping alone that weekend. It wasn't something I usually did, but something about the idea of being completely alone in the wilderness appealed to me. No distractions, no noise from the city, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I had read about a secluded campsite deep in the woods that wasn't too far from where I lived, but far enough to feel like I was escaping. The reviews online had mentioned that it was peaceful, perfect for anyone who wanted to get away from it all. The drive up was smooth, and I was excited. I had packed light: a tent, sleeping bag, a couple of changes of clothes, and enough food to last the weekend. The sun was still high in the sky when I parked at the trailhead, which was just a small dirt lot surrounded by dense forest. The trail was narrow, lined with thick bushes and towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. I could already hear the distant hum of insects and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I grabbed my backpack and started walking, following the signs that led toward the campsite. The air was fresh, and I could smell the earth and the pine trees around me. It felt good to breathe in air that didn't smell like gasoline or exhaust fumes. The trail wound through the woods, and I could hear the occasional crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of civilization faded away, leaving only the sounds of nature around me. After about an hour of walking, I arrived at the campsite. It was exactly what I was hoping for. There was a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a fire pit in the center and a few flat areas perfect for pitching my tent. I set up quickly, my hands moving with familiarity despite the fact that I didn't camp often. The tent went up without a hitch, and I gathered some firewood from the pile someone had left behind. Once the fire was going, I sat down on a log near the pit and stared into the flames. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the temperature was dropping. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and grabbed a bag of trail mix from my backpack, munching on it while the fire crackled. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. There was a sense of isolation here, far away from anyone else, and for some reason that made the place feel a little off. The forest around me seemed to be alive in its own way. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves above, the occasional snap of a twig, and in the distance, the faint sound of what might have been a large animal moving through the woods. But there were no voices, no signs of people anywhere nearby. It was just me and the wilderness. I hadn't planned on staying out long, but as the evening wore on, I found myself growing drowsy. I didn't want to go to bed just yet, though, so I decided to take a short walk around the area before heading to sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and set out into the trees, following the narrow trail that led away from the campsite. The light from my flashlight danced over the trunks of the trees, casting long, strange shadows on the forest floor. Every so often, I'd hear something in the distance. An animal, maybe, but I couldn't tell what it was. The deeper I went into the woods, the darker it seemed to get. It was as if the trees were closing in around me, blocking out the last of the fading light. I was about to turn back when I heard a noise. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sounds of my own breathing. But then it grew louder, a snapping sound, like someone stepping on a twig, followed by another, and then a faint rustling. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned around, shining the flashlight in a circle, but the beam of light only revealed the endless trees and underbrush. I swallowed hard and decided it was time to head back. I turned around and made my way back to the campsite, walking a little faster now, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. When I returned to the campsite, I was relieved to see the fire still burning brightly. I sat down by the fire again, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The forest was full of animals, and I had probably startled one of them. That was all. But as the night grew darker, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. The sounds of the forest had changed. The rustling in the trees had stopped, and there was an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Even the fire crackled in an unsettling way, like it was trying to tell me something. I glanced around, half expecting to see eyes watching me from the darkness, but the shadows were empty. I couldn't help it. I felt like I wasn't alone. The forest had always been a peaceful place to me, but now it felt suffocating, like the trees themselves were closing in on me. My eyes kept darting to the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew thicker. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring some relief. But as I lay in my tent, the feeling of unease didn't fade. The silence outside was deafening, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. I kept the flashlight close by, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because something about this place was starting to feel wrong. I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come. Then, around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual sounds of animals or wind. This was something heavier, more deliberate. I froze, holding my breath. It was close, very close. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves, as if something or someone was walking around my campsite. I tried to calm myself down. Could be a bear or a deer. Animals wander into campsites all the time. But the sound didn't stop. It moved closer, circling the campsite, and I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot growing louder. I strained my ears, but I couldn't tell what it was. It was moving in a way that felt deliberate, like it knew I was here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight and crawled out of my tent, trying to make as little noise as possible. My hands were shaking as I turned the beam of light toward the clearing, but there was nothing there. The shadows stretched long and eerie in the flickering firelight, and the trees stood tall and silent. But the noise didn't stop. It was coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight, out in the woods, and I could hear the distinct sound of something moving. I didn't know what to do. I was alone, in the middle of the woods, and whatever was out there didn't sound like an animal. It sounded too calculated, too aware of my presence. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I slowly made my way back to the tent, keeping the flashlight pointed in every direction, afraid to let my guard down. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I crawled back into my sleeping bag, trying to calm myself. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the walls of my tent, listening to every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Finally, just as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, the noises stopped. The forest seemed to return to normal, as if nothing had happened at all. I packed up quickly the next morning, not bothering to make breakfast. I didn't want to be there any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been watching me all night. I took the trail back to the car, my steps quick and my mind racing. The further I got from the campsite, the more the unease seemed to fade. By the time I reached the trailhead, I felt like I could breathe again. When I got in my car and drove away, I glanced back at the woods. It looked peaceful, normal, but I knew better. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been following me, was still in those woods. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to know. I was just glad to be away from it. And as I drove home, I made a promise to myself. I would never camp alone in the woods again. It all started with a weekend trip, just me and a couple of friends, looking to spend some time away from the hustle of everyday life. The plan was simple: hike through the dense forest, set up camp, and enjoy a few days of peace and quiet. What we didn't know was that our peaceful getaway would quickly turn into something we would never forget. We arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The forest looked inviting, with trees towering above us, their branches gently swaying in the breeze. The air was fresh and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, the kind of air that makes you feel like you've left everything behind. The hike itself was easy, the trail winding its way through thick undergrowth, with the occasional burst of wildflowers on the sides. We made small talk, enjoying the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt path, the rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. There was nothing unusual about the surroundings. The world was calm, peaceful even. By noon, we found the perfect spot to set up camp near a stream, the water gurgling softly as it ran over rocks. The trees around us were thick, their branches forming a canopy that shielded us from the harsh midday sun. We unloaded our gear, pitched our tents, and started a small fire to cook our lunch. Everything seemed perfect. We talked, laughed, and joked around, not a care in the world. But as the afternoon wore on, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a small shift in the air. The breeze picked up, making the trees sway with a rustling sound that wasn't normal. It felt like the forest was alive, but in a way that made my skin crawl. I shook it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I'd been hiking in the woods many times before. What was the worst that could happen? As evening came, we gathered around the fire, the warmth of the flames casting long shadows on the forest floor. The sun had disappeared behind the trees, and the sky was now a deep shade of purple. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks into the air. We had our dinner, telling stories and laughing, but there was still something unsettling in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. The sounds of the forest grew louder as night fell. The usual rustling of leaves and chirping of crickets was replaced by an eerie silence. It was the kind of silence that made you realize how loud the forest had been just moments before. And then, just as I began to wonder if something was wrong, I heard it. A distant sound, barely noticeable at first. It was the sound of footsteps, not the usual sounds of animals moving through the underbrush, but something that sounded deliberate. Someone or something walking on the path just beyond the edge of the camp. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at my friends, but they didn't seem to notice. They were still talking, oblivious to the noise. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound continued, slow and steady, getting closer. My anxiety started to rise. Then it stopped. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything. Nothing. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. For a few moments, I convinced myself I was imagining things. But then, the sound came again, closer this time. There was something wrong. The footsteps weren't random, they were purposeful. I glanced around the camp, feeling like I was being watched. My skin prickled, and my instincts told me to get up and do something. But I was frozen, unsure of what to do. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move just beyond the reach of the flames. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly excused myself from the group. My friends didn't seem to notice, still lost in their conversation. I moved cautiously, stepping away from the warmth of the fire and into the darkened woods. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and underbrush in front of me. But there was no sign of anything. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I reached the edge of the camp, where the trail led deeper into the woods. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes were on me from every direction. But when I turned to look, there was nothing, no movement, no sign of life. Just as I was about to turn back to camp, I heard a rustling sound coming from behind me. It was too quiet to be an animal, too deliberate to be random. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. My pulse raced as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It was then that I realized how deep into the woods I had gone. I had wandered too far. Suddenly, I heard a snap, a twig breaking, loud and sharp. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it was close, very close. I swung the flashlight around, but all I could see were trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. My name, just a breathy whisper carried on the wind. I was no longer sure if I was alone in the woods or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The forest was alive with sounds I couldn't explain, and every movement, every crack, felt amplified in the stillness. I turned around, quickly heading back toward the camp, my feet moving faster than they had all day. The brush seemed to close in around me, and the darkness felt thicker, more oppressive. By the time I reached the camp, my friends were still sitting around the fire, laughing and unaware of the fear that had gripped me. I said nothing about what I had heard, brushing it off as a figment of my imagination. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, pressing on me like a weight I couldn't shake. That night, as we settled into our tents, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The crackling of the fire had long since died down, and the quiet felt suffocating. The sounds from earlier, the footsteps, the whisper, kept playing over and over in my mind. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. At some point, I drifted off to sleep, though I'm not sure when. The night passed uneventfully, but I woke up early, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. I didn't want to waste any time. I was ready to pack up and leave, to get out of the woods and back to safety. I told my friends that I was heading back to the car to start packing, and they agreed to meet me later. I made my way back to the trailhead, walking quickly, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving me. As I passed the familiar landmarks along the trail, I realized just how far I had walked the night before. I hadn't been near the edge of the woods. I had gone deeper, deeper than I had ever intended. The realization hit me like a punch in the stomach. When I reached the car, I stopped to catch my breath. I looked back at the forest, the towering trees looming in the distance. The woods looked different now, darker, more menacing. I wasn't sure what had happened out there, what I had felt, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. My friends arrived shortly after, and we packed up our gear in silence. There was no more laughter, no more joking. We all felt it, the weight of whatever had happened in those woods. We drove away without looking back. To this day, I still don't know what I heard or felt in that forest. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something else out there? Something watching us? I'll never know for sure. But I do know this. There's a part of the woods that I'll never forget. A part that doesn't feel safe. A part that I'll never set foot in again. And I've learned never to ignore that feeling, that gut instinct that tells you when something is wrong. Because sometimes it's right. I'd always considered myself a seasoned camper. Years of hiking and trekking had taught me the ropes. How to set up camp, build a fire, and most importantly, how to stay calm in unfamiliar situations. But nothing had prepared me for the night I spent alone in the woods last autumn. It started as a regular weekend camping trip. I had the usual gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food, and enough water to last a couple of days. I went solo for peace and quiet, wanting to get away from the noise of the city and the distractions of everyday life. I found a small, secluded spot deep in the forest, far enough away from the usual trailhead, where I knew I'd be left alone. Perfect for solitude. The hike up to my campsite was uneventful. The trail was slightly overgrown, but nothing I couldn't handle. The air was crisp, the trees thick with the kind of dense foliage that only autumn can produce. I remember the rustling of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call, and the smell of pine. It was peaceful and I had no concerns. The trail had been well marked, and I knew the area well. Nothing unusual. By the time I reached the site, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the woods in a soft, fading light. I quickly set up camp, carefully choosing a spot near a small stream for the sound of running water to mask any other noise. I wasn't afraid of the dark, but I always felt better with a natural sound around me. The fire pit was clear, and I set up a small campfire to cook my dinner. The crackle of the fire was comforting as I roasted a simple meal. Just some beans and sausage, nothing fancy. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and I added more wood to the fire. The forest, which had felt alive with movement during the day, now seemed still, almost eerily so. The wind had died down, and all that could be heard was the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deep in the forest. I chalked it up to animals, deer maybe, or a lone fox, no need to worry about it. I sat there for hours, just watching the fire and letting my mind wander. I didn't feel tired enough to sleep yet, but eventually, the solitude started to sink in. It was then that I heard it, a faint rustling, distant at first, but growing steadily closer. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't sound like an animal. The best way I can describe it was the sound of something deliberately moving through the forest, stepping around branches, sliding between trees. It was unmistakable, like someone or something was coming closer. First, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a larger animal, like a bear or something, but then I remembered the trail. There were no other campsites nearby. In fact, there was nothing for miles but dense trees and thick brush. No one else would be out here, especially this late. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, and I quickly stood up, scanning the area around my camp. The firelight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch further into the trees than I expected. The rustling stopped suddenly, and I stood frozen, holding my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. There was nothing, just the steady hum of the evening night. But now the air felt wrong, thick, heavy. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was just a curious animal or perhaps the wind again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I added more wood to the fire, the crackling loud in the otherwise quiet night, trying to push the anxiety away. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It lingered, persistent and unsettling, making every shadow stretch and every creak of the forest seem like it was closing in. By now, I was on edge. Every sound made me jump. Every movement in the trees seemed like a threat. It had to be some animal, I kept telling myself. But in my gut, I knew it wasn't. Not anymore. Something was out there. Something human. The rustling came again, this time much closer. And then I heard something else. A soft, almost imperceptible sound that could have been a whisper. My heart hammered in my chest, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. But I couldn't. The fire was still going strong, and I didn't want to leave it. Leaving the fire would mean plunging into complete darkness, into the unknown of the forest with whatever was out there. The night dragged on. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself that I was imagining things, but the sounds persisted. Sometimes I thought I saw movement at the edge of my firelight, flickers of shadow darting between trees. And then, there it was again, a rustling, followed by the unmistakable snap of a twig, so loud it echoed through the trees. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. My survival instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my backpack, stuffed my sleeping bag inside, and doused the fire with dirt. The sudden silence that followed the extinguishing of the flames was deafening. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I took one last look around the campsite, my eyes frantically scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anything. With my heart pounding in my chest, I began to move cautiously toward the trail, staying low and trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind was racing with every possible scenario. Whoever or whatever was out there, I didn't want to be caught in the open. I needed to get to the trailhead. I needed help, but the forest had other plans. Just as I was about to step off the campsite and head for the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Quick, deliberate steps. My body froze. My blood ran cold. I couldn't make out the figure, but I could feel its presence just beyond the fire's light. It was real, not an animal, not a figment of my imagination. I darted into the trees, moving as silently as I could, my breath shallow and quick. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was behind me could hear it. The woods felt like a maze, every tree a potential hiding place. I had no idea how far the trail was, how close the camp was to where I needed to be. The darkness closed in, suffocating. Every sound was amplified in the silence of the night, and every twig underfoot felt like a thunderous crash. I ran. I had no other choice. The crunch of the forest floor beneath my boots was drowned out by the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stumbled through the underbrush, barely able to keep my bearings. My mind was a whirl of panic and fear. Every step felt like it might be my last. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps, the rustling, everything. The forest returned to its natural sounds. The wind, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But it didn't matter. I didn't stop to check. I didn't dare. I ran, full speed now, my legs aching, my breath ragged, until I finally saw the faint outline of the trail ahead. My body felt like it was on autopilot, a survival instinct driving me forward. I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I was at the trailhead, my heart still racing, my mind still in overdrive. The rest of the hike back to the car was uneventful, but every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, made my skin crawl. When I finally reached the parking lot, the dawn was breaking, the first light of morning chasing away the night's terror. I never went back to that spot. I couldn't bring myself to. And to this day, I don't know what I encountered in the woods that night. But whatever it was, I was glad to leave it behind. I've always told myself that if I hadn't run when I did, if I hadn't trusted that instinct deep down inside, I might not be here today. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I'm not taking any chances ever again. The woods are full of secrets, and some of them are best left undisturbed. It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a chance to escape the grind of work and city life. I had planned the trip for weeks, hoping for some peace and quiet, surrounded by nothing but the sound of nature and the rustle of trees. I didn't expect much, just a simple weekend camping trip in the woods. But it turned out to be the kind of experience I would never forget, one that would change the way I looked at nature forever. The day started out bright and sunny, perfect for a hike. I parked my car at the trailhead, strapped on my backpack, and set off. The woods were dense, with towering trees blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was fresh, and the ground was soft under my boots, littered with fallen leaves and pine needles. I hadn't realized how much I had missed this until I took my first deep breath of the cool, crisp air. I hiked for hours, the trail winding deeper into the forest. My plan was to reach a secluded campsite by dusk, far from the usual crowded spots. I was looking for solitude, and that's exactly what I got. The further I went, the less I saw of other hikers, until I was completely alone. By the time I reached my destination, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The campsite was perfect, a small clearing by a bubbling creek. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and started a fire. As I sat there, staring into the flames, I felt completely at ease. There was no one around, no distractions, just the sounds of the forest and the crackling of the fire. It felt like the kind of peace I had been craving. But as night settled in, something started to feel off. At first, it was nothing more than a sense of unease, like the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the isolation. After all, it was just me and the wilderness. The sounds of the forest grew louder as the evening wore on, but it was when the fire began to die down that I started to hear something different. Footsteps. Not the casual scuffling of an animal, but the deliberate, heavy steps of someone walking through the forest. I froze, straining my ears to hear better. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving closer to my camp. I quickly grabbed a flashlight from my bag and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but the trees. There was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound of those footsteps didn't sit right with me. I kept the flashlight in my hand, shining it around every few minutes, my mind racing with scenarios. Was someone else out here? Someone who might not be so friendly? The forest, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now felt suffocating, and every rustle of leaves made my heart race. The sound of the creek running nearby, which had been soothing, now seemed like an ominous reminder of how isolated I was. I decided to stay in the tent, not daring to step outside again. The fire was almost out, and I didn't have much wood left to keep it burning through the night. I curled up in my sleeping bag, trying to shut out the thoughts racing through my mind. The silence in the woods was deafening. No birds, no animals, just that oppressive, unnatural quiet. As I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, I heard it again. The footsteps, closer now, as if someone or something was circling my camp. I could feel the tension in my muscles as I tried to stay as still as possible, praying that whatever it was would just go away. But the steps didn't stop. They moved in a slow, rhythmic pattern, pacing around my camp like a predator stalking its prey. I felt trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. My mind raced. Should I try to confront whatever was out there? Or should I stay hidden and hope it would leave? The feeling of dread grew stronger, my breath quickening as I listened to those heavy steps drawing closer. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Everything went silent again. I held my breath, straining my ears to hear anything, but there was nothing. I decided to take a chance. I slowly unzipped the tent flap, poking my head out to see what was going on. The fire was nearly out, casting only a weak glow around the camp. Then I saw it, a shadow. Not an animal, but a figure moving between the trees. It was tall, almost too tall, and it moved with an eerie, unnatural fluidity. My heart stopped as I realized that I wasn't alone out here. Someone or something was watching me. I quickly zipped the tent flap back up, my heart pounding in my chest. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, telling myself I was just imagining things. But I knew I wasn't. I knew that something was out there, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. I had to get out of there. At dawn, I decided I would pack up and leave as quickly as possible. I had no idea what had been out there last night, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The fire was completely out now, and the woods were silent. I didn't even stop to make breakfast. I just packed my things as quickly as I could and left the campsite behind. The hike back to the trailhead was one of the longest of my life. Every crack of a twig underfoot made my heart race, and every rustle of leaves had me looking over my shoulder. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being followed, like something was right behind me. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. When I finally reached my car, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. I got in, slammed the door, and drove away without looking back. As I left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. But whatever it was, it stayed in the woods. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. I've never gone back to that campsite, and I don't plan to. I've heard stories of people disappearing in the woods, never to be seen again, and now I understand why. The forest isn't always what it seems, and sometimes the things that live in the woods are far worse than we could ever imagine. It was the middle of autumn when I decided to head into the woods for a camping trip. A last-minute decision to get away from the stresses of work. I've always loved being in nature. There's something about being away from the noise of the city that makes everything seem clearer. I had planned the trip to be a peaceful, quiet getaway. I hadn't expected things to take the turn they did. I drove for what felt like hours, the forest getting denser with each mile, the trees growing taller and more imposing. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine. It was a good kind of quiet, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. And that was just how I liked it. The woods were relatively isolated, not a common camping spot, which was exactly why I picked it. I didn't want crowds, I didn't want noise, just me and nature. I found a spot near a small stream that wound its way through the trees, the sound of water trickling over rocks adding a peaceful rhythm to the air. It was perfect. After unpacking the car, I set up my tent, made a small campfire, and threw some logs on to get a good blaze going. The sun was dipping behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. As the evening wore on, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to come alive with sounds. The crackling of the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of some bird. These were the noises I had come to enjoy. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and ate, listening to the steady chorus of the forest around me. It was exactly what I needed. But as the night deepened, things started to feel a bit off. At first, it was subtle, a strange stillness in the air, like the usual noises of the forest had faded. The wind had died down, and there was no sound of animals moving around. I tried not to think too much about it. After all, it was late, and the night was just settling in. The fire was still going strong, its light flickering in the darkness, casting long shadows around the camp. I poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers glow bright orange, and tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The trees loomed taller around me, their outlines sharp against the dark sky. I looked up at the stars for a moment, and that's when I heard it, the faint sound of something crunching on the ground. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. It wasn't the normal rustle of a squirrel or a rabbit moving through the underbrush. No, this was slower, heavier, a deliberate crunching sound. I glanced around the campsite, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. But the night was too still, the darkness too thick, and the firelight only illuminated a small circle around me. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal passing by. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The crunching sound was followed by a distinct snap of a twig. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination running wild, but it felt as though whatever was out there was circling the campsite. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight and check, but I held back. The light from the fire flickered, casting shadows that made it difficult to see past the immediate area around me. I didn't want to shine the light into the dark woods and alert whatever it was that I was aware of its presence. I sat completely still, straining my ears to catch any more sounds. There was nothing for a long moment, and then came the faintest rustling. A low, steady sound as though someone, was moving through the underbrush, deliberately trying to stay out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my pulse racing in my throat. My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation. Could be an animal, but it didn't feel like it. Felt like something much more unsettling. I grabbed a nearby stick, the firelight casting long shadows as I gripped it tightly, trying to calm myself. The tension in the air was thick, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The crunching stopped for a moment, and I allowed myself a shaky exhale, thinking that whatever it was had moved on. But then came a loud snap, a branch breaking underfoot, unmistakable and far too close. I froze. The sound was right on the edge of the camp, just beyond the light of the fire. I couldn't see anything, but I knew that something was there. My mind raced, trying to think logically. Was it a person? If so, why would they be here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? I considered my options. I could leave, pack up, and head back to the car. But the thought of driving through the dark woods alone, not knowing who or what was out there, felt worse than staying put. Besides, I didn't want to leave in a panic. I tried to remind myself that it was probably nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest playing tricks on my mind. I took a slow, deliberate breath and stood up, my hands still clutching the stick. I didn't want to show fear. I forced myself to act calm, like I was in control, even though every muscle in my body was on high alert. The darkness seemed to press in around me, and I started to regret not bringing a larger flashlight or more protection. That's when I saw it. A figure, just a shape at first, moved silently through the trees at the edge of the camp. It was tall, much taller than a normal person, and I could barely make out any details. The figure was obscured by the shadows, but it was moving with purpose, walking slowly, deliberately, as though it knew I was watching. My stomach twisted into a knot. Panic surged through me. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to move or even think. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the stick. The figure was coming closer, and every instinct in me screamed to run, to get out of there as fast as possible. But I couldn't bring myself to move. It was then that I noticed something odd. The figure wasn't moving like a person. It was too smooth, too unnatural. It seemed to glide rather than walk, and the sound of the crunching twigs had stopped. The air felt colder, the tension unbearable. I watched as the figure came into full view, stepping into the light of the fire. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person, not by any stretch of the imagination. It was a man, tall, disheveled, with wild hair and torn clothing. But his movements were jerky, almost unnatural. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, and his face, oh God, his face, was twisted in a way that made it look like he was in some sort of pain. His mouth was hanging open, and I could hear the faintest rasp of his breath as he took one step closer to the firelight. But he didn't move toward me directly. Instead, he started circling the camp, his eyes never leaving me. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move or for the right moment to strike. I had no idea who this person was or what he wanted, but I knew one thing. I had to get away from him. I grabbed my gear, my flashlight, my backpack, anything I could carry, and started backing away slowly. I tried to make as little noise as possible, but the crunch of the gravel underfoot was loud in the otherwise still night. The man didn't seem to react, but I didn't want to test how much patience he had. I moved fast, heading toward the trail that would lead me back to my car. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the figure hadn't moved. It was like he was waiting for me to go. I didn't know whether he was simply watching me, or if he had something else planned, but I couldn't take the chance. When I finally reached the edge of the camp, I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, fumbling with the keys and starting the engine as quickly as I could. The whole time, I could feel my chest tightening, my breath shallow, and my mind spinning with fear. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I could still hear the sound of my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I didn't return to that campsite. I didn't even want to think about what had happened. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone about the encounter. It wasn't something that could be explained. It was just something that felt wrong. Something that had happened in the deep, lonely woods where I thought I was safe. But as much as I tried to forget, the memory of that night lingered. The figure, the unnatural way he moved, haunted my thoughts. It wasn't the scariest thing I had ever experienced, but it was the most unsettling. And as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but feel that maybe there was something out there, something I would never fully understand. But I also knew one thing for sure: I would never camp in those woods again. Some places, I realized, are just not meant to be explored. I never expected a simple camping trip to turn into something like this. It was supposed to be just a quick getaway, a few days away from work, the noise of the city, and the constant distractions. I had planned everything down to the smallest detail. The tent, the gear, the food, everything packed and ready. The weather was perfect, and the campsite was just secluded enough to feel like I was truly away from it all. But now, in the middle of the night, I wish I'd never even thought of it. I arrived at the site around late afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky, and the forest around me seemed alive. Birds chirped from the treetops, a soft breeze rustled the leaves, and the scent of pine filled the air. It was peaceful. I set up my tent near a small creek, making sure everything was arranged just right. I always liked camping by water. It felt comforting. The sound of flowing water was always relaxing, and I figured I'd enjoy it while I had the chance. As the evening drew closer, the sky shifted from bright blue to soft shades of orange and pink. I built a small fire by the creek, the kind that would just keep me warm, but not too much, and settled into my camp chair. I had a book with me, but it wasn't long before the peaceful atmosphere lulled me into a quiet contemplation. No one else was around. It was just me, the forest, and the creek. It was at that point that I first heard it, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. First, I tried to ignore it. The forest is full of animals, after all. Could have been anything: deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I wasn't particularly worried. I'd been camping for years and had encountered animals before, but this sound didn't seem right. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or a creature moving quietly. It was heavy, deliberate, almost like something or someone was trying to be stealthy. I stayed still, hoping whatever it was would just pass by. I couldn't see anything through the thick trees around me, but I kept my eyes trained on the darkness beyond the firelight. The noise continued, coming closer, moving from one side of me to the other. Then it stopped. I waited. Nothing. No more sounds. The wind picked up, the leaves rustled, but that was it. I shook my head, trying to push the thought from my mind. Maybe it was just a deer, or perhaps some other animal that I hadn't seen yet. Still, a creeping unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't right, the way it had moved so deliberately. I tried to focus on my book again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That sense of being watched never quite went away. Every so often, I'd hear another noise from the woods, the twigs snapping under weight, the rustling leaves. But it was always just distant enough for me to brush it off. Until suddenly it wasn't. I stood up, my heart pounding. I saw something out of the corner of my eye, movement, but it wasn't like before. This time it was closer, much closer. Something large, dark, and quick flashed across the tree line, and then it was gone. I froze, staring into the dark. For a moment, I felt a cold wave wash over me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My first thought was bear. Maybe a bear had gotten too close, but I didn't think bears moved quite like that, so fast, so deliberately. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, heart hammering, and scanned the trees. The beam of light flicked across the forest. Nothing. My breathing slowed, but the unease never left. I shone the light in the direction where I'd seen the movement, and just as I did, I thought I saw something. It was quick, a flicker of motion, too fast for me to properly see, but I could tell something was there. My skin prickled. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was watching me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the darkness. The fire crackled behind me, but it seemed so small now, so weak against the vastness of the forest. I had always felt safe camping before, but not this time. Not with whatever was lurking out there. I turned quickly and made my way back to the tent, my steps hurried but deliberate. I didn't want to show fear, but my mind was racing. Something wasn't right. I unzipped the tent and crawled inside, securing the flap as quietly as I could. I didn't feel safe out there anymore, not even with the fire burning. Inside the tent, I sat down and tried to calm myself. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. Not that it would have helped. I was far off the beaten path, miles from civilization. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I felt a growing sense of dread. There was something out there, something that wasn't normal. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes, I couldn't tell. I lay there in the dark, listening, every little sound making me jump. The wind continued to howl outside, and the sound of the creek was louder now, crashing against rocks. But I couldn't focus on that. All I could think about was the movement in the trees. Something had been out there. Something that wasn't a bear, or a deer, or anything I'd ever encountered before. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up with a start, feeling groggy and disoriented. The sun was already high in the sky, and the forest around me seemed peaceful once more. It was a false sense of calm, though. I could still feel the weight of the night pressing down on me, but I needed to shake it off. I wasn't going to let myself be scared away by whatever had happened. I packed up quickly and headed to the nearby hiking trail to clear my mind. The trail wound through thick trees, and the further I walked, the more I tried to push the fear from my thoughts. I needed to remind myself that I was just out in nature. It was all in my head. I told myself that over and over as I trudged along the path. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a mark on one of the trees, a deep gouge, like something had scraped it with claws. It was fresh, the wood still oozing sap, and it was too high up to have been made by an animal, at least one of the ones I knew. I kept walking faster now. My mind raced, trying to figure out what could have done that, but nothing seemed to make sense. I heard the rustling again, faint but distinct. This time, though, it wasn't distant. It was close, very close. I turned around, scanning the forest, but saw nothing. Then I heard a loud crack, like a branch breaking. I spun back toward the sound, heart pounding. But this time, there was no movement, just the trees, the quiet. I stood frozen for a long time, too scared to move, but too terrified to stay still. Every part of me screamed to run, but I didn't know where to go. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this felt right. I turned back, heading toward my campsite, but the walk back was slow. Every rustle, every snap of a twig had me jumping. By the time I reached my tent, I was out of breath, my body on edge. But then I saw it. The fire pit I had left clean and tidy the night before was a mess. Ashes were scattered around the campsite, and the wood I had stacked neatly was knocked over. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. Footprints, large, heavy ones in the dirt. They led from the tree line toward my tent. I had to leave. There was no choice. Whatever had been out there, whatever had made those marks on the tree and knocked over my firewood, was close. Too close. I packed my things as quickly as I could, not caring if I forgot something. The fear was overwhelming now. I needed to get out of there before it found me. I didn't waste any time, just started running down the trail, not looking back. It wasn't until I reached the parking lot, my heart hammering in my chest, that I allowed myself to stop. I was out of breath, trembling, but safe. I never went camping there again. The memories of that night still haunt me. I don't know what it was out there in the forest, but I know one thing for sure. I don't ever want to find out. I've always loved camping, ever since I was a kid. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the crisp air, and the chance to disconnect from everything that makes the whole experience feel like an escape. This time was supposed to be just like any other camping trip, a weekend getaway to enjoy the outdoors. Little did I know it would turn into something much more unsettling. I had been planning this trip for a while. It was just me this time, no friends, no family, just a solo camping adventure to recharge. I chose a remote area I had read about online. It wasn't too far from home, about a 4-hour drive, but it was deep in the woods, far enough away from any towns or people to make it feel secluded. I'd always wanted to camp somewhere truly isolated, where the silence was only broken by the sound of wildlife. I arrived just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a golden light through the trees. The air was still warm, but the chill of nightfall was starting to set in. The trail to the campsite was narrow and winding, a little overgrown with the late summer growth. The further I went, the less well-marked it became. I had a map and a compass, so I wasn't worried, but the trail didn't seem as well-traveled as I had expected. The campsite was about a mile off the main trail, tucked between some dense trees with a clear view of a small creek. It was perfect. I set up my tent and unloaded my gear, settling in for a quiet night under the stars. The firewood I'd brought cracked and popped in the campfire, casting long, flickering shadows around the campsite. I ate a simple dinner, just some trail mix and a protein bar, then lay back in my camp chair to enjoy the stillness. As the night wore on, the woods around me grew darker and quieter. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just the occasional chirp of a distant cricket and the steady flow of the creek. I felt comfortable, almost at peace. After a while, I decided to turn in. I stowed the food in a bare bag, tucked my backpack into the tent, and zipped it shut. The night was cold now, and I curled up in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the slight discomfort of the hard ground beneath me. I'd been camping enough to know that sleep was never perfect, but that didn't bother me. I drifted off slowly, the sounds of the forest lulling me to sleep. Then it happened. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. A snap of a twig, a rustle in the underbrush. I lay still, straining my ears in the darkness. There was no wind, so it wasn't the trees. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, this time closer. A crunching noise, as though someone or something was walking through the forest. I froze. My heart started to beat harder, faster, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, I thought, a deer or a raccoon. But the sound didn't stop. It kept coming, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. I told myself to stay calm. I wasn't new to the outdoors. I knew there were animals and I knew how to handle them. But this didn't feel like an animal. There was something deliberate about the way the steps came closer, then paused, then came closer again. It wasn't the random movement of an animal foraging for food. No, this was someone or something watching me. I held my breath and strained to listen. The crunching stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was silent again. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. I didn't have a weapon, not even a knife within reach. All I had was my flashlight, my campfire, and my nerves. Then the sound came again, louder this time, right next to my tent. I could hear something breathing, slow and deliberate, almost like it was waiting for me to react. The breath wasn't animal-like, though. It was too deep, too steady. I felt my throat tighten as I tried to stay as still as possible. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. I wanted to get up, to look outside, to do something, but I didn't want to risk it. What if there was someone out there? What if there was something out there? I clutched my flashlight tightly, praying it wasn't something I'd have to use. The sound of breathing continued, but now it was moving away. I didn't know if it was moving in circles around me or if it was just retreating deeper into the woods. My heart was racing now, my whole body tense. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Nothing came. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, but the fear lingered. The next morning, I woke up groggy, my body aching from the tension of the night. The sun had risen, casting long shadows across the campsite, but the air still felt thick with unease. I quickly packed up my things, deciding that I would leave early. Maybe it had been an animal, or maybe just my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I was packing up my tent, I noticed something odd. The ground around my campsite had been disturbed. There were deep footprints in the soft earth, leading up to my tent and then back into the trees. They weren't animal tracks, these were too large, too human. My heart sank. I had heard someone moving around last night. Had they been watching me? Why hadn't I heard them leave? I quickly packed the rest of my gear, not caring to make everything perfectly neat. I just wanted to get out. I hurried down the trail, keeping my eyes constantly darting around, expecting someone, or something, to jump out at any moment. I didn't look back, not once. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was out of breath, my nerves frazzled. I got to my car and locked the doors immediately, taking a deep breath before starting the engine. I was shaking, but I was relieved to be leaving. It wasn't until I got home that I started to calm down, but the memory of those footprints, of the sounds in the night, kept me on edge. I didn't know who or what had been out there with me, but I was thankful to be away from it. That's the part that gets me. The woods are supposed to be peaceful, calm, a place to escape, but what I learned is that they can also be dangerous. Not just because of animals or the wilderness, but because of the unknown. I never did figure out who or what was out there with me that night, but I do know one thing for sure. Next time, I'll choose a campsite a little closer to civilization. Some things are better left unexplored. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. The idea of escaping the daily grind and retreating into the wilderness seemed like the perfect way to unwind. After all, what could be more peaceful than a weekend camping trip in the woods, far from the noise of the city? The plan was simple. Find a quiet spot, pitch a tent, enjoy some fresh air, and disconnect from everything for a couple of days. It seemed harmless enough, maybe even idyllic. But that trip quickly turned into something I'll never forget. It was a Friday afternoon when I set off. I packed my gear the night before. A tent, a sleeping bag, a backpack filled with food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a few other camping essentials. I also brought a small stove for cooking and a good knife just in case. It was just me, no friends or family to join this time. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I kind of preferred it. There was something calming about being out in nature, just you and the wilderness. I arrived at the campground around noon. The air was fresh and cool, and the trees around the area were tall and thick. The sun was shining brightly, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The campsite wasn't crowded, which I appreciated. A few other tents dotted the area, but they were spaced out far enough that I wouldn't have to worry about noisy neighbors. I chose a spot near a small stream that trickled through the woods, thinking the sound of running water would lull me to sleep at night. Setting up the tent was quick work, and soon I had everything arranged. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for a peaceful evening. The sky slowly shifted to a dark blue, and the stars started to appear, twinkling above like tiny diamonds. It was quiet, too quiet. At first, I didn't think much of it. The sounds of the forest were usually subtle at night, but as the hours passed, the silence started to feel heavier. There were no animal sounds, no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the occasional pop from the fire and the quiet gurgling of the stream. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. The chill in the air made the warmth of my sleeping bag even more inviting. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a faint rustling noise coming from the edge of the campsite. It was too quiet to be an animal. There was no crunching of leaves or snapping of twigs. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It was almost like Footsteps? The idea seemed ridiculous. I was miles from the nearest road, and there was no one around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to ignore it. Could have been the wind, or maybe some animal moving through the underbrush. But the sound didn't stop. It lingered for several minutes, and I found myself wide awake, listening to every tiny noise around me. My mind started to race with possibilities, none of them good. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I'd be fine, but I couldn't bring myself to fall back asleep. Instead, I lay there in the darkness, staring at the inside of my tent, heart pounding in my chest. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of rain tapping gently on the tent. It wasn't a heavy downpour, but it was enough to make the air smell fresh and earthy. The rain seemed to wash away the unease from the night before, and I decided to venture out to gather more firewood. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my hatchet, and stepped outside. The forest was damp, but the rain had subsided for the moment. I walked a few yards from the campsite, picking up branches and tossing them over my shoulder. The ground was soft and slippery, and the trees around me were shrouded in mist. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth, and the only sound was the soft drip of rainwater from the trees above. I felt a bit more at ease out here, surrounded by nature, but something still gnawed at me, a sense of unease I couldn't shake. It was as if the woods were watching me. As I turned back to return to camp, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud, leading toward my tent. They weren't mine, and they didn't look like any animal tracks I recognized. They were large, heavy prints, as if someone had been walking around the campsite during the night. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. I walked cautiously back to my tent, checking the area for any signs of disturbance. Nothing seemed out of place, but my mind was racing. Someone had been out here and they were close. I spent the rest of the day on edge, trying to keep my focus on the tasks at hand. I cooked a small meal, reorganized my gear, and did my best to ignore the gnawing feeling that someone was still watching me. But as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. The silence had returned, but this time it felt different. It was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the dark edge of the campsite, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. Then I heard it again, the same faint rustling sound, just on the edge of my hearing. This time, it wasn't as subtle. The sound was closer, more deliberate. My pulse quickened, and I stood up, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. I was no longer willing to convince myself it was just an animal. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, turned it on, and scanned the perimeter of the campsite. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and underbrush, but there was nothing there. Still, the rustling continued. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again, and I swallowed hard. Someone was definitely out there, and they were getting closer. I spent the next few hours in a state of heightened alertness, constantly scanning the shadows around me. Every crack of a branch, every flutter of a leaf sent my heart racing. I felt trapped in my own skin, unable to escape the tension that had settled over me. I told myself I was being irrational. I was a grown adult, and there was no reason to be this scared. But logic had no hold on my emotions at that moment. As the night wore on, I finally heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer to my tent. They stopped just on the other side of the thin fabric. I held my breath, praying they would go away, but they didn't. I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible breathing, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought it would give me away. Whoever it was, they knew I was here. I didn't know what to do. I was far from help, and my phone had no signal. I considered packing up and running, but I knew that wouldn't be smart. If someone was out there, running would just make me an easier target. I had no choice but to wait and pray that they would leave. I slowly inched toward the entrance of the tent, my hands still gripping the flashlight, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary. The footsteps resumed, and they circled the camp, drawing closer and closer. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who would do something like this? Why? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, the unmistakable snap of a twig breaking underfoot, just outside my tent. This time, the footsteps didn't stop. They moved quickly, as if the person had realized I was awake. I tensed, my fingers trembling around the flashlight, waiting for whatever would happen next. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. There was absolute silence again, and the tension in my chest began to ease, just slightly. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sound. But there was nothing. I risked peeking out from the tent, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise. Nothing. No one was there. The campsite was quiet, the fire still smoldering in the middle of the circle of stones. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. The rest of the night passed without incident. I barely slept, too afraid to close my eyes for long. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, eager to leave. I didn't bother to cook breakfast or make any coffee. I just wanted to get out. My hands were shaking as I folded the tent, and every snap of a twig in the distance had me on high alert. By the time everything was packed and the fire was out, I was ready to leave the forest behind. I didn't look back. The walk back to the car felt like the longest of my life, every step heavier than the last. When I finally reached my vehicle, I threw my gear in the trunk, slammed the door, and drove away as fast as I could. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I never went camping again after that. And every time I hear a rustle in the woods or see a footprint in the dirt, I remember that night. Something or someone was out there watching, and I'll never forget the fear that gripped me in the silence of the forest. Camping has always been my escape. There's something about leaving behind the constant noise of the city and trading it for the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls that feels refreshing. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, picking a spot deep in the woods, a place far enough from the usual campsites to ensure solitude. I wanted to disconnect, to clear my head, and just be alone with nature for a while. The drive to the trailhead took about 3 hours. It was early autumn, and the leaves had just started to change, painting the forest in shades of orange, red, and yellow. The air was cool but not cold, perfect for hiking. My pack was heavier than usual because I'd brought everything I'd need for 3 days. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit, the essentials. I'd also packed a small hatchet and a sturdy knife, tools I'd learned to always have on me when venturing into the wilderness. The trail was quiet. I passed a few other hikers early on, exchanging brief nods and smiles, but after a couple of hours, it felt like I had the whole forest to myself. The farther I went, the narrower the trail became, until it was barely more than a faint path through the underbrush. This was exactly what I'd been looking for. Solitude, peace. I reached my intended campsite in the late afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a shallow creek running nearby. The sound of the water was soothing, and the spot felt perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire to cook my dinner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and the forest grew darker. The fire's glow was comforting, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. After eating, I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. It felt peaceful, but there was also an underlying unease that I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was just the isolation or the way the darkness seemed so absolute out here, far from any artificial light. I told myself it was just my imagination and climbed into my tent for the night. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up with the sun filtering through the trees and spent the day exploring the area around my campsite. I followed the creek upstream, found a few interesting rocks, and even spotted a deer grazing in the distance. It felt good to disconnect, to be alone with my thoughts. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle, just a nagging sensation at the back of my mind. I'd stop and look around, but there was never anyone there. Just the trees, the underbrush, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. That evening, I built another fire and cooked my dinner. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. It wasn't just in my head. I was sure of it. The forest felt different, quieter somehow. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed muted, as if the animals were hiding from something. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't shake the unease. When it was time to sleep, I made sure my knife was within reach inside the tent. The second night was not as peaceful as the first. I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It was faint, like footsteps, but heavier than an animal. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. I gripped the knife tightly, my palms sweating. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, knife still in hand. There were no tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I'd heard. Someone had been outside my tent. I debated packing up and leaving, but I'd come out here to get away, and I didn't want to cut the trip short because of some unexplained noise. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day close to camp, keeping my fire going even during the day. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was never anything. As night fell on the third day, I decided to keep the fire burning all night. I gathered as much wood as I could and built the flames high. I stayed by the fire, unwilling to retreat to the tent. The forest was eerily quiet again, and my nerves were on edge. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were deliberate, slow, circling the clearing. I couldn't see anything beyond the firelight, but I could hear them, moving just out of sight. I stood up, knife in one hand, hatchet in the other, trying to make myself seem bigger. "Who's there?" I shouted into the darkness, my voice trembling. There was no response, but the footsteps stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the shadows, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as suddenly as before, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my gear and started the hike back to the trailhead. My nerves were frayed, and every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail was empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. The sense of relief was overwhelming as I drove away, leaving the forest behind. But even now, days later, I can't stop thinking about those footsteps, about the feeling of being watched. Whoever or whatever was out there, I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. It was late autumn when I decided to take a solo camping trip. The leaves had already turned to vibrant shades of red and gold, and the air carried that crisp bite that signals the onset of winter. I needed a break from work, from people, from the constant hum of technology. The idea of disconnecting for a few days in the wilderness sounded perfect. I chose a remote area in the mountains, one I had visited a few years ago with friends. It was quiet, far from any towns or even well-used trails. Exactly what I was looking for. I arrived at the trailhead around midday. My backpack was heavy with gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, a small stove, and other essentials. The hike to my planned campsite was about 8 miles, mostly uphill, but I was in decent shape and felt confident. The trail was narrow, winding through dense forests that occasionally opened to reveal stunning views of the valley below. I didn't see another soul on the way, which only added to the sense of isolation I was craving. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. The campsite was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by towering pines. The sound of the water was soothing, and the ground was soft with a thick layer of fallen leaves. I set up my tent quickly, knowing that the temperature would drop sharply once the sun disappeared. I gathered some wood for a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for the evening. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig kept my senses on edge. I reminded myself that these were normal forest noises. Still, there was something unnerving about being completely alone out here. I forced myself to focus on the crackling fire and the stars overhead, which were brighter than I'd ever seen. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to an odd sound. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? Maybe a raccoon? But it didn't quite fit. The steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I stayed still, listening intently. The footsteps circled my campsite, pausing occasionally. Whoever or whatever it was, they were just outside the range of my firelight. I regretted letting the fire die down before going to bed. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard outside. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away, disappearing into the forest. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, clutching my knife and flashlight until the first light of dawn. The next morning, I convinced myself it was an animal. I checked around the campsite but found nothing unusual. No tracks, no signs of disturbance. I tried to shake off the unease and decided to explore the area. The day was clear and cold, perfect for hiking. I followed the stream for a while, marveling at how untouched everything felt. But no matter how beautiful the surroundings were, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, I made sure to gather plenty of wood to keep the fire going all night. As the sun set, I felt the same oppressive solitude settle over me. The forest seemed quieter than the night before, as if it were holding its breath. I stayed close to the fire, listening for any signs of movement. Hours passed without incident, and I started to relax, thinking the previous night had been a fluke. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more deliberate. They came from the direction of the stream, stopping just outside the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my hands trembling. I shone the beam toward the sound, but all I could see were trees and shadows. Then I noticed something. A faint outline, barely visible, moved between the trees. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. They were too far to make out any details, but the way they moved, slow, deliberate, almost stalking, sent a chill down my spine. I called out, my voice shaking, but there was no response. The figure disappeared into the darkness, and the forest was silent again. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally came, I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the trailhead felt much longer than it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I felt exposed, like something or someone was following me, just out of sight. About halfway back, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. On the side of the trail, partially hidden by leaves, was a makeshift shelter, a lean-to made of branches and covered with a tarp. Inside were remnants of a fire, empty cans, and a pile of dirty blankets. It was recent, too recent. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't just some random spot. Someone had been living here, possibly watching me. I hurried back to the trailhead, my senses on high alert. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back seat and locked the doors. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the mountains. Even now, weeks later, the memory of that trip haunts me. I can't explain who or what was out there, but I've learned my lesson. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable, and sometimes you're not as alone as you think. It started as a simple camping trip, a break from the monotony of daily life. I had planned it for weeks. A solo getaway deep into the woods where I could clear my mind and disconnect from the chaos of city life. I chose a spot in a remote national park, far from any designated campsites. The idea of solitude, surrounded only by towering trees and the sound of nature, was exactly what I needed. The drive to the trailhead took me hours. By the time I arrived, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. I double-checked my gear: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, and my trusty knife. Everything was there. I locked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started down the trail. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the scent of pine and damp earth filling the air. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals scurrying about. Felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. As the sun dipped lower, I decided to veer off the main trail to find a more secluded spot to set up camp. I wanted to be far away from any other hikers, though I hadn't seen a single person since arriving. I hiked for another hour, bushwhacking through undergrowth until I found a small clearing. It was perfect, flat ground surrounded by thick trees, with a small stream nearby for water. I pitched my tent quickly, eager to get everything set up before darkness fell. By the time I had a fire going, the sky was a deep shade of blue, stars beginning to poke through. Dinner was simple: a can of beans heated over the fire. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet. The crackling fire was the only sound, aside from the occasional hoot of an owl. After finishing my meal, I sat back and stared at the flames, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in months. The worries of work and life seemed a million miles away. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was growing colder. Crawling into my sleeping bag, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I'd needed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was silent, eerily so. I lay still, straining my ears for any sound. Then I heard it, a faint crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started to race. Could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound didn't fade away like an animal passing through. Stayed circling my tent. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I held my breath, clutching the knife I'd left beside my sleeping bag. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it another camper? But why would someone be wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night? Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, listening. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. Sleep was out of the question, so I stayed awake, gripping my knife until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. When I finally mustered the courage to unzip my tent and step outside, the campsite looked untouched. No sign of anyone or anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I decided to stay close to camp that day, venturing only a short distance to collect firewood and refill my water supply. As the day went on, I tried to convince myself that I'd overreacted. Maybe it really had been an animal, and my imagination had done the rest. By the time evening rolled around, I'd almost managed to convince myself that I was being paranoid. That night, I made sure the fire burned brighter and longer. The flickering flames made me feel safer, though the shadows they cast seemed to dance and shift in unsettling ways. I forced myself to eat dinner, though my appetite was gone. Every little sound put me on edge. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, each one set my nerves on fire. I stayed up as late as I could, staring into the fire, knife in hand. But eventually, exhaustion won out. I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning outside, and tried to sleep. Once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, the sound was unmistakable. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were closer than before, right outside my tent. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a hand pressed against the fabric of the tent. I could see the outline of fingers through the thin material. Panic surged through me. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. I gripped my knife so tightly my knuckles turned white, ready to defend myself if the tent was breached. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand withdrew. The footsteps retreated, fading into the forest. I lay there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. When I finally dared to move, I realized I was drenched in sweat. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first rays of sunlight appeared, I packed up my gear. I didn't care about finishing my trip. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my heart racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought me to tears. I tossed my backpack into the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It's been weeks since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was it just some prankster trying to scare me? Or was it something more sinister? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I'll never camp alone again. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. I had planned this camping trip for weeks, hoping to escape the monotony of my daily life. My job had been eating away at me, the endless emails and meetings leaving little room for peace of mind. I wanted silence, the kind only the wilderness could offer. So, on a crisp Friday morning, I loaded my car with supplies, a tent, sleeping bag, food, and a sturdy pair of hiking boots, and set off toward the national forest a few hours away. The drive itself was uneventful, but as the roads turned narrower and the trees grew denser, I felt the first hints of excitement. The forest had always been my retreat. The thought of spending a few nights under the stars, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of nature, was comforting. I had chosen a spot well off the beaten path, away from the more popular camping areas. It was a small clearing near a stream that I'd visited once years ago, a place I remembered fondly for its seclusion and beauty. By early afternoon, I had parked my car at the edge of the dirt road and began the short hike to my campsite. The trail was overgrown, evidence that few people ventured this way. I had to push aside branches and step over fallen logs, but I didn't mind. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. When I finally reached the clearing, it was just as I remembered. A flat, grassy area surrounded by towering pines, with the gentle murmur of the stream nearby. I set down my pack and began to set up camp. By the time the tent was up and my gear organized, the sun was dipping low in the sky. I gathered some firewood and built a small fire, its warmth and light a comforting presence as the forest grew darker. I cooked a simple meal over the flames and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was perfect. That first night I slept deeply. The cool air and the rhythmic sound of the stream lulled me into a peaceful slumber. When I woke the next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light through the trees. I spent the day exploring the area, wandering along the stream and venturing deeper into the woods. I spotted deer tracks, watched birds flit from branch to branch, and even found a patch of wild blueberries, which I picked and added to my breakfast. By late afternoon, I decided to return to camp and relax. As I approached the clearing, I noticed something that made me pause. My tent flap was open. I was certain I had zipped it closed before leaving. A small knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I brushed it off. Maybe I hadn't secured it as tightly as I thought. Still, I checked inside to make sure everything was as I'd left it. Nothing seemed out of place, so I dismissed my unease and went about my evening. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt different, the shadows darker and the sounds sharper. I told myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of being alone in the wilderness. But then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? A bear? But the steps were too deliberate, too human. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle tensed, listening as the footsteps circled the clearing. They stopped just outside my tent. My hand instinctively went to the small knife I kept in my pack. The seconds stretched into minutes, the silence pressing down on me. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreat, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, clutching the knife and staring at the tent walls, waiting for the sound to return. When morning came, I emerged from the tent cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of what or who had been there. The ground was littered with leaves and twigs, but I couldn't find any clear footprints. Still, the unease lingered. I debated packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. I'd driven hours to get here, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin the trip. To distract myself, I decided to hike to a nearby ridge that offered a stunning view of the forest. The climb was steep, and by the time I reached the top, my legs were burning and my shirt was damp with sweat. But the view was worth it. The forest stretched out in every direction, a sea of green punctuated by the silver ribbon of the stream. For a while, I forgot about the strange noises and simply enjoyed the beauty around me. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to camp. The shadows lengthened, and the woods took on a different character, the friendly sunlight replaced by a dim, foreboding light. When I reached the clearing, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The firewood I had gathered earlier was scattered across the campsite, as if someone had kicked it around. My gear, too, was in disarray. The tent was still standing, but the stakes had been pulled partially out of the ground. This was no animal. Someone had been here. My chest tightened as fear took hold. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but I saw no one. Whoever had done this was gone, at least for now. I quickly set about securing the camp, driving the tent stakes deeper and gathering more firewood. I built the fire higher than before, the flames a small barrier against the encroaching darkness. That night I barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I kept the knife close, my grip tightening on it with every sound. At some point, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke, it was early morning, the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. The camp was untouched, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I packed up my gear, I found something that shattered that illusion. Carved into the trunk of a tree at the edge of the clearing were 3 deep, deliberate slashes. They hadn't been there the day before. My hands trembled as I traced the marks. This was no accident, no animal. Someone was trying to send a message. I didn't waste any more time. I threw my gear into my pack and doused the fire. The hike back to the car felt interminable, every sound a potential threat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the dirt road and saw my car, relief washed over me. I tossed my pack into the trunk and got behind the wheel, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, the tension began to ease, but the questions remained. Who had been in my camp? What did they want? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I won't be camping alone again. The wilderness may offer peace, but it also holds its share of dangers, and not all of them come from nature. Camping had always been something I looked forward to, a way to escape the daily grind and immerse myself in nature. This time, I planned a solo trip to a remote area in the Pacific Northwest. The idea of being alone in the wilderness, far from the noise of civilization, felt liberating. I packed light but ensured I had all the essentials: a sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a first aid kit, and a GPS device in case I got lost. The drive to the trailhead took hours, winding through dense forests and narrow mountain roads. By the time I parked and started hiking, the sun was already high in the sky. The trail was rugged but manageable, weaving through towering pines and moss-covered rocks. I felt a deep sense of peace as I walked, the only sounds being the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional chirping of birds. After several hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a view of a sparkling creek nearby. The water looked so clear and pristine that it seemed almost untouched by human hands. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and prepared a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and feeling completely at ease. That night, I slept deeply. The cool air and the gentle rustling of the trees lulled me into a peaceful slumber. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something strange. My backpack, which I had left just outside the tent, was unzipped. Nothing seemed to be missing, but I could have sworn I had zipped it up before going to bed. I shrugged it off, assuming I must have been careless. Still, a small part of me felt uneasy. I decided to spend the day exploring the area. The forest was dense, but there were faint animal trails that made it easier to navigate. I followed one trail that led me to a small, secluded lake. The water was so still that it mirrored the sky above, creating a perfect reflection of the scattered clouds. I spent hours there, basking in the tranquility and taking in the beauty around me. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was beginning to set again. That night, As I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard something. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. This was different. It was faint at first, like soft footsteps in the distance. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped abruptly. I sat up, my heart pounding. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but the unease from earlier crept back in. The next morning, I noticed more oddities. A pile of firewood I had stacked was scattered around, as if someone or something had knocked it over. Again, nothing was missing, but the sense that I wasn't alone began to weigh on me. I decided to cut my trip short and pack up. The thought of staying another night made my stomach churn. As I packed, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden under some leaves, was a small, weathered object. I picked it up and realized it was a hiking boot. It was old and covered in dirt, but it didn't look like it had been there for too long. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. I hastily finished packing and started back down the trail. My mind raced with questions. Who had left that boot? And why was it there? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The forest, which had felt so welcoming before, now seemed oppressive. Every shadow and rustling leaf made me jump. About halfway back to the trailhead, I noticed something else. On the side of the trail, etched into the bark of a tree, were deep scratches. They were too large to have been made by any animal I knew of in the area. My pulse quickened, and I quickened my pace. The final stretch of the hike felt like it took forever. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back seat and locked the doors. As I sat behind the wheel, trying to steady my breathing, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. In the distance, just at the edge of the tree line, I thought I saw movement. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it looked like a person. I didn't wait to find out. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could. For weeks after the trip, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Who had been out there with me, and what were they doing? I never found out, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never camp alone again. It all started with a simple idea: to get away from the noise of daily life. I had a week off work, and the thought of spending it in the wilderness felt like the perfect escape. There was a spot I'd been meaning to visit for a while, deep in the forest, about a 5-hour drive from the city. It wasn't a well-known campsite, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, and all the essentials. I made sure to bring a map and compass, even though I had my phone and a portable charger. I'd learned enough to know that technology isn't always reliable out there. The drive was peaceful. As the city skyline disappeared behind me, the roads became narrower and the scenery more rugged. By the time I reached the forest's edge, it was mid-afternoon. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt road. I parked my car in a small clearing and double-checked my supplies. My plan was to hike about 3 miles to a secluded spot I'd marked on my map, set up camp, and spend the next few days exploring. The trail was faint but visible, winding through tall pines and dense underbrush. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. The air smelled fresh and earthy, a mix of pine and damp soil. I felt a sense of calm as I walked, the kind you only get when you're far from the chaos of everyday life. After about an hour, I found the spot. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick trees. The ground was soft and level, perfect for setting up a tent. I unpacked and got to work. The tent went up easily, and I gathered some wood for a small fire. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the temperature began to drop. I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal, then sat back to enjoy the solitude. The crackling fire was the only sound, and the flickering flames cast long shadows on the trees. I felt a sense of accomplishment, being out here on my own, relying on my own preparation and skills. By the time I crawled into my tent, it was completely dark. The forest was alive with sounds: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of some nocturnal animal. I wasn't scared. I'd camped alone before and was used to the noises of the night. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the rhythm of the stream nearby. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. For a moment, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the tent was pitch black. I lay still, listening. The usual forest sounds were there, but something felt off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. There was a faint crunching sound, like footsteps, coming from the woods. They were slow and deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other harmless creature. Still, I felt uneasy. I reached for my flashlight and shone it through the tent's thin fabric. The beam illuminated the trees outside but revealed nothing unusual. The crunching stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and lay back down. Sleep didn't come easily, but I must have dozed off eventually. The next morning, the unease from the night before felt like a distant memory. The sun was shining, and the forest seemed peaceful again. I decided to spend the day exploring the area. I followed the stream for a while, enjoying the quiet and taking in the scenery. The forest was dense, and I didn't see another soul. That was part of the appeal, though. I wanted to be alone. By midday, I'd covered a few miles and decided to head back to camp for lunch. As I approached, something caught my eye. At first, I couldn't quite place it, but as I got closer, I realized what it was. There were footprints in the soft dirt near my tent. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger and deeper, as if made by someone heavier than me. They circled my tent and led off into the woods. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the tracks. I hadn't seen or heard anyone, and this area wasn't exactly a popular hiking spot. Who could it have been, and why had they been near my tent? I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The forest was silent, almost oppressively so. I decided to stay calm. Maybe it was just another hiker passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the day close to camp, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. As evening fell, I built another fire and tried to push the footprints out of my mind. I told myself I was overreacting, letting my imagination get the better of me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, every little sound amplified in the silence. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunching of footsteps. This time, they were closer. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was still burning low, casting a dim glow over the clearing. I scanned the area but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stayed awake for hours, too scared to close my eyes. Eventually, the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, and I felt a wave of relief. I stepped outside, exhausted but determined to figure out what was going on. That's when I noticed something new. Near the edge of the clearing, there was a small pile of rocks that hadn't been there before. It looked deliberate, like someone had stacked them carefully. I'd had enough. This was no longer the peaceful getaway I'd envisioned. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt different now, less welcoming. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every sound felt like a warning. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept my pace steady but fast, trying not to let my fear take over. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked, I felt a huge sense of relief. That relief was short-lived, though. As I approached my car, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Scratched into the dirt on the driver's side door was a single word: leave. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the car and climbed in. I started the engine and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away. Even then, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally got home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I told myself it was probably just some local messing with me, someone who didn't like outsiders camping in their woods. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Whoever it was, they'd gone out of their way to make me feel unwelcome. The footprints, the rocks, the message on my car. It all felt too deliberate. I haven't been camping since. I still think about that trip sometimes, replaying every detail in my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. But the truth is, I'll probably never know who was out there with me or what they wanted. All I know is that I've never felt truly alone in the woods again, even when I'm miles away from anyone. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe solitude isn't as safe as we like to think. The campsite wasn't anything special, just a small clearing off a dirt road, surrounded by towering pines and underbrush thick enough to block out most of the wind. It was late autumn and the days were getting shorter. I had driven out here to get some time away from everything. The job, the emails, the endless hum of city life. I wanted peace and quiet, but I wasn't prepared for how isolated this spot felt. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. Even my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the soft ground. The sun was already low when I parked my car at the edge of the clearing. I had planned to set up camp earlier, but delays back home meant I didn't get on the road until after lunch. Still, there was enough light to pitch the tent, gather some firewood, and get settled. The temperature was dropping quickly, and I could feel the cold creeping in as I worked. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I was grateful for the heavy jacket I'd packed. Once the tent was up and my gear was organized, I turned my attention to the fire. The wood was damp from the previous night's rain, making it a challenge to get a decent flame going. After some frustration, I managed to coax a small fire to life. It wasn't much, but it was enough to provide some warmth and light. I sat close to it, eating a simple meal of canned soup heated over the flames. The silence around me felt heavy, almost oppressive. I've been camping alone before, but something about the spot felt different. Maybe it was the time of year or the fact that the nearest town was over an hour's drive away. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination. The mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in the woods. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf becomes a potential threat. I tried to focus on the fire, letting its warmth and light ground me. Eventually, the tension eased, and I felt a bit more relaxed. After finishing my meal, I sat back and stared at the stars. Out here, away from the city lights, the sky was stunning. Thousands of stars glittered above me, and for a while, I felt a sense of peace. As the night wore on, the fire began to die down. I added a few more logs, but decided not to stay up too late. I wanted to get an early start in the morning to explore some of the nearby trails. I doused the fire, leaving only a few glowing embers, and climbed into my tent. The cold hit me immediately, and I quickly zipped up my sleeping bag. The thin walls of the tent did little to block out the chill, but at least they provided some sense of security. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was mostly quiet, but every now and then, I'd hear something. A distant crack, a faint rustle. I told myself it was just the wind or some small animal moving through the underbrush. But the unease I'd felt earlier hadn't entirely disappeared. I kept my flashlight within reach just in case. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up suddenly to a sound outside the tent. It was faint but distinct, the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. My heart started pounding as I lay there, straining to listen. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving closer to the tent. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too heavy, too human. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. The steps stopped just outside the tent, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then, I heard a faint rustling, like someone brushing against the fabric. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another camper? A lost hiker? Or something worse? I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam towards the source of the sound. The light illuminated the tent wall, but I couldn't see anything beyond it. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but the silence stretched on. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the tent. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise put me on edge, and I kept the flashlight on for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of what had been out there. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, making it difficult to spot tracks, but I did find one clear footprint near the tent. It was large, unmistakably human, and pointed towards the woods. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to let fear ruin the trip. I convinced myself it was probably just a hunter or another camper passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to stick close to the campsite that day and avoid venturing too far into the woods. As the hours passed, the events of the previous night began to feel less threatening. I kept busy, gathering more firewood and exploring the immediate area. By the time evening rolled around, I felt a bit more confident. I built a larger fire that night, its bright flames providing a sense of security. I stayed up later, watching the fire and trying to enjoy the solitude. But as the night deepened, the familiar feeling of being watched returned. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they came from the direction of the woods, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the trees, but the beam revealed nothing. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I shouted into the darkness, demanding whoever it was to show themselves. There was no response, just the faint crackle of the fire and the rustling of leaves. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire, clutching a heavy branch I'd found earlier, ready to defend myself if necessary. The footsteps didn't return, but the sense of unease lingered. When morning finally came, I made the decision to pack up and leave. As much as I hated to cut the trip short, my gut told me it wasn't safe to stay. As I loaded my gear into the car, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. I'd wanted an escape, a chance to reconnect with nature and find some peace. Instead, I'd spent 2 nights on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the clearing was empty, but the woods beyond seemed darker, more menacing. Back home, I tried to put the experience behind me. I told myself it was probably just another camper or a hunter passing through, someone who didn't realize how close they were to my tent. But a part of me couldn't let it go. The heavy footsteps, the silence when I called out, the single footprint by the tent. None of it added up. I haven't been camping alone since. Every time I think about going back, I hear those footsteps in my mind, slow and deliberate, moving through the darkness. And I remember the feeling of being watched, the weight of unseen eyes following my every move. It's a feeling I can't forget, no matter how much time passes. I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. Life had been overwhelming, and I needed a break from the constant noise of the city. The idea of spending a few days in the wilderness seemed like the perfect way to recharge. I chose a remote area in the mountains, a spot I'd heard about from a coworker who'd raved about its pristine beauty and solitude. It wasn't a designated campground, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to be alone, surrounded only by nature. I packed carefully, making sure I had all the essentials. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, a first aid kit, and a map of the area. I even brought a small GPS device, though I didn't plan to use it unless absolutely necessary. My phone wouldn't have service out there, but I told a friend where I was going and when to expect me back. I figured I was prepared for anything. The drive to the trailhead took about 4 hours, and the last stretch was on a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense forest. When I finally arrived, there was no one else around. It was exactly what I'd hoped for, quiet and secluded. I parked my car, shouldered my backpack, and started hiking. The trail was faint, more of a suggestion than a path, but I followed it confidently. The map showed that it would lead me to a small lake about 6 miles in, where I planned to set up camp. The hike was harder than I expected. The trail climbed steadily, and the weight of my pack made every step feel like a challenge. The forest was thick, the trees towering above me and blocking out much of the sunlight. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, but I didn't see any wildlife. Still, the air was fresh, and the solitude was exactly what I'd been craving. By the time I reached the lake, my legs were aching, but the view was worth it. The water was crystal clear, surrounded by rugged cliffs and tall pines. Felt like I'd stumbled into a postcard. I found a flat spot near the lake and set up my tent. After unpacking my gear, I filtered some water and made a simple dinner of instant noodles and jerky. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. I put on a jacket and sat by the water, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. That night, I lay in my tent listening to the sounds of the forest. The occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves was comforting at first, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone out here. But as the hours dragged on, I started to feel uneasy. There was a strange, intermittent noise I couldn't identify, a faint thudding, like someone was tapping on wood. It wasn't constant, just enough to keep me on edge. I told myself it was probably a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. Still, I had trouble falling asleep. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to make the most of the day. I decided to explore the area around the lake. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a small day pack with water, snacks, and my map. The forest was beautiful, but it felt different in the daylight. Less intimidating, more inviting. I followed the shoreline, occasionally venturing into the woods to check out interesting rock formations or clusters of wildflowers. I even found a small stream that fed into the lake, its water sparkling in the sunlight. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't anything obvious, just a subtle sense of unease. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a deer or maybe a bear, but there was nothing. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. After all, I was alone in an unfamiliar place. It was natural to feel a little paranoid. Around midday, I decided to head back to camp. When I arrived, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but then I noticed that some of my gear had been moved. My water bottle, which I'd left next to my tent, was now lying on the ground a few feet away. A small bag of trail mix was open, its contents scattered. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into my stuff, but nothing was damaged, and there weren't any bite marks. It was as if someone had picked through my belongings and then left them behind. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd seen no signs of other people since I'd arrived. The thought that someone might be out here, messing with my gear, was deeply unsettling. I scanned the area but saw no one. The forest was as quiet as ever. I decided to pack up and move to a different spot, farther from the lake. I didn't want to stay in a place where someone might have been lurking. After hiking for about an hour, I found another campsite. It wasn't as picturesque as the first, but it felt safer. I set up my tent again and tried to settle in, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That night, the strange tapping sound returned. This time, it was closer, and I could hear it moving around, as if whatever was making the noise was circling my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. I gripped my flashlight tightly, ready to turn it on at the slightest hint of trouble. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and I must have fallen asleep, though it was fitful at best. When I woke up the next morning, I was exhausted but determined to figure out what was going on. I decided to hike back to my car and cut the trip short. The peace and solitude I'd been seeking had turned into a source of anxiety. As I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints around my tent, human footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger and fresher. Someone had been here, walking around my campsite while I slept. My hands trembled as I finished packing. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Whoever had been out here with me wasn't trying to hide their presence anymore. The hike back to the car was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest, once a place of beauty and peace, now felt oppressive, its shadows hiding unknown threats. Every snap of a twig made me jump. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. When I finally saw my car, I felt a wave of relief. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I was certain I'd locked it before I started the hike. My stomach churned as I peered inside. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the contents of the glove compartment had been dumped onto the seat. Someone had been inside. I didn't waste any time. I threw my pack into the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. The narrow dirt road seemed to stretch on forever, and I didn't feel safe until I was back on the highway, surrounded by other cars. Even then, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They took down the details but didn't seem particularly concerned. It was a remote area, they said, and sometimes people wandered through without realizing they were on private land. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Whoever had been out there with me hadn't just stumbled across my campsite by accident. They'd been watching me, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. I haven't been camping since. The wilderness, once a place of solace and renewal, now feels like a place of danger. I still think about that trip sometimes, wondering who was out there and what they wanted. I'll probably never know, but one thing is certain: I'll never take solitude for granted again. It started as a last-minute trip. My friend, Sam, was supposed to join me, but he bailed a few days before. I'd already booked time off work, packed my gear, and studied the map, so I decided to go alone. The plan was simple: hike into the forest, camp by the lake for a couple of nights, and then hike back. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to reset. The forest was vast and untouched, located about a 3-hour drive from the city. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your lungs feel alive when you breathe it in. The gravel crunching under my boots was the only sound as I started the hike. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through towering pine trees. Occasionally, sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss-covered ground. I carried everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a water filter, and a small first aid kit. My pack was heavy, but manageable. As I walked deeper into the forest, I felt the weight of civilization lifting off my shoulders. There was no cell service, no noise, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. About 3 hours in, I reached a clearing with a stunning view of the lake. The water was so still it looked like a giant mirror, reflecting the blue sky and surrounding trees. This was where I'd set up camp. I chose a spot near the tree line, not too close to the water but with a clear view of the lake. After pitching my tent, I set up a small fire pit and collected some dry wood. The first evening was uneventful, almost idyllic. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, watched the sun dip below the horizon, and listened to the symphony of crickets and frogs. As darkness enveloped the forest, I crawled into my tent, feeling content and relaxed. The cool air and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore lulled me to sleep. I woke up around midnight to a sound. First, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was a faint, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on gravel. My heart rate spiked as I lay there, frozen, listening. The sound was coming from the direction of the trail, slowly getting closer. I told myself it could be an animal, a deer maybe, but the deliberate pace of the steps felt too human. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Shining the light into the darkness, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. The sound had stopped. I stood there for a while, straining my ears, but all I heard was the gentle rustling of leaves. Convinced it was just my imagination, I crawled back into the tent and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. About 10 feet from my tent, near the fire pit, was a single boot print. It was large, much larger than my own, and fresh. I looked around but saw no other prints. The forest floor was covered in moss and leaves, which could explain why there weren't more tracks. Still, it unsettled me. I'd been careful to follow leave no trace principles, and I was certain no one else was supposed to be out here. Trying to shake off the unease, I spent the day exploring the area. I followed a smaller trail that led up a hill, giving me a panoramic view of the lake and the surrounding forest. The beauty of the place was undeniable, but I couldn't fully enjoy it. My mind kept drifting back to that boot print. I told myself it could have been left by another hiker days ago, though deep down I didn't believe it. As the sun set, I returned to camp and built another fire. The crackling flames and the warmth were comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd shine my flashlight into the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just darkness and the occasional rustle of a small animal. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed amplified. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a loud thud. It was close, too close. My first thought was that something had fallen, maybe a branch, but when I unzipped the tent and looked outside, I saw my firewood scattered across the ground. It had been neatly stacked the night before. Panic set in. Someone had been here while I was sleeping. My flashlight beam darted around the campsite, but there was no one, no movement. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Grabbing my knife, I sat in the tent, clutching it tightly, and waited for dawn. When morning finally came, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The peaceful escape I'd envisioned had turned into something else entirely. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I stopped several times, listening intently, but heard nothing unusual. Still, the sensation persisted, like eyes were on me, just out of sight. About halfway back, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. Hanging from a tree branch at eye level was a small bundle, wrapped in what looked like burlap and tied with twine. My curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully untied it. Inside were three things: a rusty nail, a tuft of hair, and a small piece of paper with a single word scrawled on it: "Leave." My hands trembled as I dropped the bundle and hurried back to the trail. I'd read stories about people finding strange things in the woods, but I never thought I'd experience it myself. The remaining hike was a blur. I moved as fast as I could without breaking into a run, my heart pounding the entire way. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. But there was no one. I don't know who left that boot print or the bundle, and I don't want to know. What I do know is that I'll never camp alone again. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now feels like a place where I don't belong. And maybe that's the point. Some places aren't meant to be shared. I've always been a fan of camping. The quiet nights under a canopy of stars, the crackling of a campfire, and the feeling of being surrounded by nature. It all brought me peace. But after this trip, I'm not sure I'll ever step foot in the woods again. It was late September, and the weather was perfect for camping. The days were warm but not too hot, and the nights were just cool enough to make a fire necessary. I'd picked a remote spot in the mountains, far from any towns or even well-traveled trails. The idea was to disconnect completely, no phone, no emails, no people. Just me and the wilderness. The hike to the campsite was challenging but manageable. I'd packed light, just the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, some dried food, water purification tablets, and a small first aid kit. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The spot was perfect. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a stream running nearby. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the stream that I could hear the gentle gurgling of water. After setting up camp, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. As the night fell, the stars came out in full force, and I sat by the fire, soaking in the solitude. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining, and everything felt calm and serene. I spent the day exploring the area, following the stream as it wound its way through the forest. I even found a small waterfall, where I sat for a while, enjoying the sound of the water crashing against the rocks. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was beginning to set again. I started another fire, cooked dinner, and settled in for another quiet night. But as the darkness deepened, I began to feel off. It's hard to describe, but there was a sense of unease that hadn't been there the night before. The forest seemed quieter than usual, and the shadows cast by the firelight felt darker, more oppressive. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the middle of the woods. It was natural to feel a little spooked. But as the night wore on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set my heart racing. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the dark, straining to hear any sounds outside the tent. The forest was eerily quiet now, with only the occasional rustle breaking the silence. And then I heard it. Footsteps, faint at first but unmistakable. They were slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, listening intently. The footsteps seemed to circle my campsite, moving closer and then farther away. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer, maybe, or a curious raccoon. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too measured. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the footsteps continued. At one point, they stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, praying whoever or whatever was out there would just leave. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I cautiously unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The clearing looked just as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I checked around the campsite for any signs of intruders but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there. Despite my unease, I decided to stay one more night. I convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The day passed uneventfully, but as the sun set and darkness fell, the sense of dread returned. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I sat in the dark, my flashlight in hand, listening for any sounds. For hours, there was nothing, just the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of a cricket. But then, just like the night before, I heard the footsteps. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They circled the campsite again, coming closer and closer to my tent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I gripped my flashlight tightly, ready to use it as a weapon if I had to. And then the footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. I could hear breathing now, heavy, labored breaths, as if whoever was out there had been running. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just sat there, clutching my flashlight, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps moved away again. I stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to close my eyes. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and left the campsite. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail was empty, and I didn't see another soul until I reached the parking lot. When I finally got to my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my gear in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I noticed something on the hood of my car. It was a single handprint smeared in what looked like mud. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't mud. It was blood. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with me, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going camping alone again. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up, my dad and I would spend weekends hiking through dense forests and pitching tents in remote places. The silence of the wilderness, the crackle of the campfire, and the occasional rustling of leaves at night always gave me a sense of peace. But one camping trip changed that for good. It was late September when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. The summer crowds had faded, leaving the forests quieter than usual. I planned to spend 3 days hiking through a less traveled trail in the Green Mountains, a place I'd explored with my dad years ago. It was supposed to be a way to disconnect from the noise of daily life, to find some clarity. I packed my gear, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food, a GPS, and a first aid kit. My backpack was heavier than I liked, but I figured it was better to be over-prepared than caught off guard. The first day was uneventful, just as I had hoped. The trail was rugged but manageable, winding through thick forests with the occasional clearing that offered breathtaking views of the mountains. The weather was perfect, with crisp air and clear skies. I stopped for lunch by a small stream, the sound of water gurgling over rocks adding to the serenity. By late afternoon, I found a flat spot to set up camp near a cluster of tall pines. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and an owl hooted in the distance. I felt completely at ease. The second day started just as smoothly. I broke camp early and continued along the trail. The terrain became steeper, the trees denser. Around midday, I reached a ridge with a stunning view of the valley below. I stood there for a while, taking it all in before pressing on. That afternoon, the trail became harder to follow. Fallen leaves covered the path, and some of the trail markers were faded or missing. I relied on my GPS to stay on course. It wasn't the first time I dealt with this, so I wasn't too worried. By late afternoon, I started looking for a place to camp. The ground was uneven, and the forest was thicker than I'd expected. Eventually, I found a small clearing. It wasn't ideal, the ground was sloped slightly, and the trees around it felt oppressively close, but it would have to do. As I set up my tent, I noticed how quiet it was. The usual forest sounds were absent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. I brushed it off as my imagination and focused on building a fire. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was unsettling, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. When I finally crawled into my tent, I struggled to fall asleep. Every little noise, the creak of a tree, the snap of a twig, made my heart race. But eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced. Could be an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. But something about it didn't feel right. The rustling wasn't random. It was deliberate, methodical, like footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Shining the beam into the darkness, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. The sound had stopped. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight and listening for any sign of movement. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When it finally did, I packed up my gear in record time and decided to cut my trip short. I'd had enough solitude. The trail seemed harder to follow on the way back. I blamed it on my lack of sleep and the lingering unease from the night before. By midday, I realized I was lost. My GPS showed I was off the trail, but no matter which way I went, I couldn't seem to find it again. The dense forest all looked the same. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had enough supplies to last a couple of days, and I knew the general direction of the main road. If I kept moving, I'd find my way eventually. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a gut feeling, a primal instinct screaming at me to stay alert. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the endless forest. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a makeshift campsite. It wasn't marked on my map, and it didn't look like an official site. There was a fire pit surrounded by a few logs for seating, and a tarp strung between two trees. But what caught my attention was the state of it. The fire pit was cold, and the logs were weathered, suggesting it hadn't been used in a while. Yet there were fresh footprints in the dirt around the site. They weren't mine. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, that deliberate rustling, the sound of footsteps. This time they were behind me. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Slowly, I turned, scanning the trees with my flashlight. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a dark shape slipping between the trees. But it was gone before I could be sure. I didn't run. Running in the woods is a good way to trip and injure yourself, and I couldn't afford that. Instead, I walked as quickly and quietly as I could, putting as much distance between me and that campsite as possible. The footsteps didn't follow, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, I didn't make a fire. I found a spot that was as concealed as possible, surrounded by thick bushes, and set up my tent. I didn't eat. I didn't want to do anything that might draw attention. Instead, I sat in the darkness, clutching my flashlight and knife, and listening. The forest was alive with sounds, but none of them felt right. Every crack, every rustle, set my nerves on edge. At some point during the night, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something brushing against my tent. My blood ran cold. It was faint, like a hand running over the fabric. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The brushing stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the tent shook violently, as if someone had grabbed it and was trying to pull it down. I screamed, grabbed my knife, and slashed at the side of the tent. The shaking stopped, and I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up and started moving. I didn't care which direction I was going. I just wanted to get out. By midday, I heard the faint sound of running water. Following it, I found a stream that wasn't marked on my map. Streams often lead to larger bodies of water or roads, so I decided to follow it. The terrain was rough, and I stumbled more than once, but the sound of the water was a lifeline. By late afternoon, I reached a dirt road. Relief washed over me, and I almost cried. I didn't know where the road led, but it didn't matter. Roads meant civilization. I followed it for what felt like hours until I heard the hum of an engine. Waving frantically, I flagged down a pickup truck. The driver, an older man with a kind face, looked concerned as I explained what had happened. He offered to drive me to the nearest town, and I didn't hesitate to accept. Sitting in the safety of the truck, I finally allowed myself to relax. The man asked if I wanted to report what had happened to the authorities, but I declined. What would I say? That I'd gotten lost and spooked in the woods? That someone or something had stalked me? Without proof, it would sound like a wild story. Instead, I thanked him and focused on getting home. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. Was it a person, maybe a hermit or someone with ill intentions? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me, amplifying every sound and shadow? I'll never know. What I do know is that I've never gone camping alone again. The wilderness may be beautiful, but it's also vast and unforgiving. And sometimes it's better to leave it alone. Camping in the wilderness has always been my escape from the grind of daily life. There's something about the quiet, the smell of pine trees, and the crackling of a campfire that soothes my mind. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, a solo adventure into a remote area I'd never explored before. I had my gear ready, a map of the region, and enough supplies to last 4 days. The spot I'd chosen was deep in the forest, far from any cell service or human interference. It sounded perfect. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I parked my car in a small gravel lot, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The trail was well marked at first, winding through dense trees with sunlight streaming through the leaves. As the hours passed, the path grew narrower and less distinct. I wasn't worried, though. I'd studied the map carefully and had a compass with me. The plan was to hike about 10 miles to a secluded lake, set up camp, and spend the next few days fishing, reading, and just soaking in the solitude. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was stunning. The water was so clear I could see fish swimming near the bottom. The surrounding trees formed a natural barrier, making the area feel like my private haven. I picked a flat spot near the shore to pitch my tent and gathered some wood for a fire. After setting up camp, I sat by the water, letting the stillness sink in. The first night was uneventful. I'd cooked a simple meal over the fire, listened to the sounds of the forest, and drifted off to sleep as the stars filled the sky. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to explore the area. I spent most of the day hiking around the lake, following animal trails that led to hidden coves and streams. I saw deer, a family of ducks, and even a fox darting through the underbrush. By the time I returned to camp, I was exhausted but content. As the sun set, I built another fire and prepared dinner. The temperature dropped quickly once the light faded, and I was grateful for the warmth of the flames. That's when I first noticed it. A faint smell of smoke that wasn't coming from my fire. It was subtle, almost like burnt wood mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. I dismissed it as my imagination or maybe the wind carrying the scent from somewhere far away. The second night was different. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling sound outside my tent. I lay still, listening intently. The sound came again, like someone or something brushing against the nylon fabric. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a curious deer. Still, I reached for the flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly. When I shone the beam outside, there was nothing there. Just the empty forest, shadows dancing in the light. I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next day, I noticed something odd. A pile of rocks near my camp that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't big, just a small stack of flat stones balanced on top of each other. It struck me as unusual but not alarming. People sometimes build cairns as markers or for fun, though I hadn't seen any signs of other campers nearby. I decided to ignore it and spent the day fishing. The lake was generous, and I caught enough for dinner. As I cooked the fish over the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest felt different, quieter somehow, as if the usual background noise of birds and insects had been muted. That night, the rustling returned, louder this time. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps moving slowly around my tent. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. The noise stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside to find another pile of rocks near the first one. This time there were more, a dozen or so, arranged in a neat circle. My stomach tightened. This wasn't random. Someone had been here. I decided to pack up and leave. The plan was to hike back to the car, but as I retraced my steps, I realized the trail looked different. Trees that I didn't remember passing now seemed familiar, as if I were walking in circles. My compass pointed north, but the path didn't align with what the map showed. Panic started to creep in. I told myself to stay calm and kept moving, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center was a crude wooden structure, almost like a small shack or shelter. It looked old, the wood weathered and gray. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. I approached cautiously, peering inside. The interior was empty except for a pile of animal bones in one corner. They were clean, stripped of all flesh, and arranged in a pattern that didn't look natural. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away and decided to keep moving, sticking to what I thought was the right direction. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew darker, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. My legs ached, and my water supply was running low. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard it again, the rustling, now coming from multiple directions. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, like something closing in. I broke into a run, my heart hammering in my chest. Branches whipped against my face, and the underbrush snagged at my clothes. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Eventually, I burst out onto a dirt road. Relief flooded through me as I recognized it as the access road leading to the trailhead. I followed it, ignoring the burning in my legs and lungs, until I saw my car in the distance. I practically dove inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands trembled as I started the engine and drove away, not daring to look back. When I got home, I couldn't shake the experience. I'd always thought of the wilderness as a place of peace, but now it felt like something else entirely. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, but I've learned one thing for sure. Solitude in the wild can be just as terrifying as it is beautiful. I've always enjoyed the solitude of camping alone. There's something peaceful about the quiet nights, the crackling campfire, and the feeling of being surrounded by nothing but wilderness. So, when I had a 3-day weekend coming up, I packed my gear and drove out to a spot I'd been meaning to check out for months. It was a remote area deep in the mountains, far enough away from any towns that I wouldn't run into other campers. The drive was uneventful. The further I got from the main roads, the more rugged the terrain became. By the time I reached the trailhead, my car was coated in dust, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least an hour. That's how I knew I'd picked the right place. I strapped on my backpack, adjusted my hiking boots, and set off down the trail. The air was crisp, and the pine trees stretched high above me, their needles blocking out most of the sunlight. The hike was harder than I anticipated. The trail was steep in places, and I had to stop more than once to catch my breath. I didn't mind, though. The scenery was stunning, and every step took me further away from the noise of civilization. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. I pitched my tent near a small stream and started a fire. The flames danced in the cool evening air, and I sat back with a sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I needed. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and listened to the sounds of the forest. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was all so calming. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping. I spent the day exploring the area, taking short hikes and snapping photos of the breathtaking views. By the time I returned to my campsite, I was exhausted but happy. I cooked dinner and settled in for another quiet night. That's when things started to feel off. It began with a noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the bushes, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. The sound seemed to be coming from the woods just beyond the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, and tried to brush it off. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the perimeter of my campsite, staying just out of sight. I've camped enough to know that animals can get curious, especially if there's food around. Still, something about this felt different. The footsteps were too heavy for a small animal, and they moved with an unsettling precision. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but branches and leaves. The footsteps stopped. For a while, everything was silent. I sat by the fire, gripping the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. Eventually, I convinced myself that whatever it was had moved on. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. Took me a long time to fall asleep, and when I did, my dreams were restless. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Just outside my tent, the ground was disturbed. The dirt had been kicked up, and there were clear footprints. Human footprints. They circled my tent and then led off into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Was someone messing with me? How had they gotten so close without me hearing them? I decided to pack up and leave. The idea of spending another night out here didn't sit right with me anymore. As I was breaking down my tent, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, eager to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, at the edge of the trailhead, partially hidden by the trees, was a figure. They were standing perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but the sight of them sent a chill down my spine. I didn't wait to get a better look. I hit the gas and sped down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they hurt. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I've replayed it in my mind countless times, trying to make sense of it. Was it just a coincidence? Some other hiker who decided to camp nearby? Or was it something more sinister? All I know is that I've never gone camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my mind. Life had been overwhelming lately, and I needed some time away from the noise of the world. The idea of spending a weekend alone in the woods sounded peaceful. I packed my gear carefully: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, plenty of food and water, and the usual essentials like a flashlight and a first aid kit. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual trails, where I could truly disconnect. The drive to the trailhead took a few hours, winding through small towns and into dense forests. The last stretch was a dirt road, bumpy and overgrown. By the time I parked my car and shouldered my backpack, the sun was already low in the sky. I checked the map one last time and started hiking. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had planned my route carefully. I felt confident navigating with my map and compass. The forest was beautiful, with tall trees stretching high overhead and the golden light of evening filtering through the leaves. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. It was exactly what I needed. After about an hour of hiking, I found a small clearing near a creek. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood. The creek provided fresh water, and the sound of it trickling over the rocks was soothing. By the time I had a fire going, the sun had set, and the forest was dark. The flames cast flickering shadows on the trees around me. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and stared into the fire. The quiet was almost unnerving. Back home, I was used to constant noise, cars, people, the hum of electronics. Out here, the silence was profound. Occasionally, I'd hear a distant owl or the snap of a twig, but otherwise, it was just me and the forest. That night, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep quickly, tired from the hike and the fresh air. But my sleep was restless. I woke up several times, thinking I'd heard something outside. Each time, I told myself it was just the wind or an animal and drifted back to sleep. At one point, though I thought I heard faint footsteps near the tent. They were slow and deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. My heart pounded as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. But the sound didn't come again, and eventually, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the tent. The forest felt peaceful again, and I laughed at myself for getting spooked. I made breakfast, packed a small day pack, and decided to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream, climbing over rocks and fallen trees. The forest grew denser as I went, the trees closing in around me. After about an hour, I stumbled upon something unexpected, an old, abandoned cabin. It was small and weathered, with moss growing on the roof and vines creeping up the walls. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar. Curious, I approached cautiously. The cabin looked like it hadn't been used in years. I peered inside and saw a single room with a rusted wood stove, a rotting table, and a couple of broken chairs. There were some old cans and bottles scattered on the floor, and the air smelled musty. It was unsettling, but also intriguing. Who had built this cabin, and why had they left it? I lingered for a few minutes, taking in the eerie atmosphere, before heading back to my campsite. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. It felt out of place, like a relic from another time. I wondered if anyone else knew about it or if it had been completely forgotten. The thought was both fascinating and unsettling. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, determined to get a good night's sleep. But once again, I woke up in the middle of the night, this time to a distinct sound, something moving through the underbrush. It was close, too close. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light outside. The beam illuminated the trees and bushes around my campsite, but I didn't see anything. The sound had stopped. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening. Then I heard it again, further away this time, the crunch of leaves and the snap of a twig. It was deliberate, like footsteps. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I lay back down, though it was a long time before I fell asleep. The next morning, I decided to move my campsite. I packed up my gear and hiked further into the forest, finding another spot near a different creek. This clearing felt more open, less claustrophobic. I set up camp again and spent the day exploring, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. But as evening fell, the feeling of being watched returned. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I wasn't alone. That night, I kept the fire burning longer than usual, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat by the flames, clutching my flashlight and listening intently. The forest was alive with sounds, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves. But beneath it all, I thought I could hear something else, something faint and irregular. I couldn't pinpoint it, but it set my nerves on edge. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the flashlight within arm's reach. I lay there for hours, wide awake, jumping at every little sound. Around midnight, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. This time, they were closer than ever, circling my campsite. My mouth went dry, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought it would give me away. I didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound moved away, fading into the distance. The first light, I packed up and left. I didn't care about finishing my trip or exploring further. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to my car felt endless. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I nearly cried with relief. I threw my gear into the back seat and drove away as fast as the dirt road would allow. Looking back, I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by the isolation and the eerie setting. Maybe it was an animal curious about my campsite, but part of me wonders if someone was out there watching me, following me. I'll never know for sure. All I know is that I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. Camping has always been my way of unwinding from the chaos of daily life. I grew up camping with my dad in the forests of Vermont, and even now, living in Switzerland, the urge to escape into nature hasn't left me. So when I got a free weekend, I packed my gear and decided to head out to a spot I'd heard about. A remote campsite deep in the woods, a good 2-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. It was supposed to be quiet, untouched, and far from civilization. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the kind of long, winding roads I'd grown used to over the years. I reached the parking lot around noon, strapped on my backpack, and started walking. The trail wasn't well marked, which was part of its appeal. The farther I went, the fewer signs of other people I saw. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush denser, and the noise of the outside world faded until all I could hear were the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional crunch of twigs underfoot. About an hour into the hike, I came across a small stream. It wasn't on the map, but it was crystal clear, and I figured it was as good a place as any to refill my water bottle. I knelt down, letting the cool water flow over my hands, and took a moment to appreciate the serenity. That's when I noticed something odd. A single muddy footprint on the opposite bank. It was human, bare, and larger than my own. I stood up, scanning the area, but saw no one. Shrugging it off as a random hiker who might have passed through earlier, I continued on. The trail became steeper as I climbed higher into the hills. The air grew cooler, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patches. By the time I reached the campsite, it was late afternoon. The spot was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a flat area for my tent and a fire pit someone had built years ago. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat down to enjoy the solitude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I started a fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames and the sound of crackling wood were comforting. I sat there for hours, staring into the fire and letting my mind wander. The forest around me was dark and silent, the kind of quiet that can feel both peaceful and unsettling. Occasionally, I'd hear the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves, but I told myself it was just the wind or some small animal. When I finally decided to call it a night, I doused the fire and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and the exhaustion from the hike made it easy to drift off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up to a sound that made my heart race. The distinct crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, close to my tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the campsite. I strained my ears, trying to determine how many there were, but it was hard to tell. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal? Another camper? Something more sinister? I didn't have a weapon, just a small camping knife and a can of bear spray. I reached for both, gripping them tightly as I lay there, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, the silence deafening. Then, a faint scratching sound began, like fingers brushing against the fabric of the tent. It moved along the side, slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there might hear it. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself. "Don't panic." After what felt like an eternity, the scratching stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the tent and into the woods. I didn't move for a long time, too scared to even breathe. Eventually, The sounds faded, and the forest was quiet again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent cautiously, clutching the bare spray. The campsite looked undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to pack up and head back to the trailhead. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A single muddy footprint near the edge of the clearing. It was bare, human, and identical to the one I'd seen by the stream. The hike back was nerve-wracking. Every sound, every shadow put me on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The forest, which had felt so inviting the day before, now seemed ominous. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting into shapes that played tricks on my mind. The trail felt longer, the path less familiar. I quickened my pace, driven by an instinctual need to get out. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was relieved to see my car exactly where I'd left it. I threw my gear into the back seat and got in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The trailhead was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I drove straight home, vowing to stick to more populated campsites in the future. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I've never felt more vulnerable in my life. Camping was supposed to be an escape, a way to connect with nature and find peace. But now, every time I think about pitching a tent in the woods, I can't help but remember the sound of those footsteps and the sight of that footprint. Whatever it was, it reminded me that the wilderness isn't as empty as we like to think. It's vast and unpredictable, and sometimes it's better to leave certain places untouched. I decided to go on a solo camping trip. It had been years since I'd done anything like it, and I missed the quiet of the wilderness. Work had been a grind, and the thought of getting away from emails, deadlines, and endless meetings sounded like the reset I needed. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, and a small camp stove. I even bought a new backpacking GPS and a high-quality flashlight, just to be safe. I chose a spot in a national forest a few hours away from my house. It wasn't a popular area, which was perfect for me. I wasn't looking for crowds or campgrounds filled with noisy families. I wanted solitude. I had found a trail on a map that led to a small, unnamed lake about 6 miles in. The reviews said it was peaceful, surrounded by thick pine forest, and rarely visited. That sounded like exactly what I wanted. The drive was uneventful. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late morning. The parking lot was small, with just enough space for about 6 cars, and when I arrived, mine was the only one there. That gave me a weird mix of excitement and nervousness. I loved the idea of being alone in nature, but the thought of being truly isolated made me realize just how much I was relying on my gear and my own abilities. The trail started out easy, winding through tall trees with patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. The air was crisp, carrying that earthy smell of fallen leaves and damp soil. I made good time at first, the weight of my backpack feeling manageable, even comfortable. The first couple of miles were smooth, with the trail well marked and obvious. Birds called out from the trees, and I even saw a couple of deer grazing in a clearing. Around mile 3, the trail started to change. It narrowed significantly, and the ground became uneven with exposed roots and rocks. I had to slow my pace, keeping an eye on where I stepped. The forest also felt denser here. The trees grew closer together, and the sunlight that had been filtering through earlier was now blocked by thick branches. I didn't see any more wildlife, and the only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By the time I reached the lake, it was mid-afternoon. It was exactly as described. A small, still body of water surrounded by towering pines. The surface was so calm it looked like glass, reflecting the trees and sky. There was no sign of anyone else, no litter, no trails leading down to the water. It felt untouched. I walked along the edge until I found a flat spot a little way back from the shore to set up my camp. The ground was soft with a layer of pine needles, and the trees provided enough cover to make me feel tucked away. I pitched my tent, unpacked my gear, and set up a small fire pit using rocks I found nearby. After everything was in place, I took a moment to just sit by the water. The silence was almost overwhelming. It's funny how you don't realize how much noise you're used to until it's gone. There were no cars, no hum of distant machinery, no voices. Just the occasional creak of a tree swaying in the wind and the faint lapping of water against the shore. As evening approached, I started a fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth and light of the flames felt comforting as the temperature dropped. I watched the sun dip below the treetops, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink before fading to deep blue. The stars came out quickly, filling the sky with a brilliance you can't see in the city. I sat by the fire for hours, enjoying the peace. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt a deep sense of contentment. I zipped up the flap, slid into my sleeping bag, and listened to the quiet as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up abruptly sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still, straining to hear any sound outside the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were pitch black. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started racing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but the steps sounded deliberate, like someone walking slowly and carefully. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, listening, my ears straining for any sound. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been the wind or a branch falling. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, though it took me a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I felt a little silly for getting so worked up. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild in the unfamiliar setting. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area around the lake. I didn't have a specific plan, just a desire to stretch my legs and see more of the forest. I followed the shoreline for a while, then veered off into the trees, keeping the lake in sight so I wouldn't get lost. That's when I found the first odd thing. It was a small pile of rocks, carefully stacked in a way that didn't look natural. It reminded me of a cairn, but there was no trail here that it could be marking. I crouched down to examine it, but there wasn't anything special about the rocks themselves. They were just ordinary stones placed deliberately. I shrugged it off and kept walking. A little further on, I found another pile and then another. Each one was about the same size, made of similar rocks and spaced irregularly. They didn't form a line or a circle. There was no pattern I could discern. It was unsettling, but I couldn't explain why. Maybe someone else had camped here before me and made them for some reason. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun was high in the sky. I decided to spend the afternoon relaxing, reading a book I'd brought, and enjoying the peace. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and as evening fell, I felt a little more at ease. That night, I was woken again by the same sound. Footsteps. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quickly, shining the beam into the trees. Again, there was nothing, but the footsteps stopped the moment I moved. I stayed up for hours, sitting by the dying fire with my flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. I didn't hear the sound again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. In the morning, I decided to pack up and head back to the trailhead. The unease had gotten to me, and I no longer felt the peace I'd come here for. As I was taking down my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Around the perimeter of my campsite, there were more of those rock piles. They hadn't been there the day before. I finished packing as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but the trail behind me was always empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. My car was right where I'd left it, the only one there. I threw my backpack in the trunk and got in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I don't know what I experienced out there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I let my imagination get the better of me. But I haven't been camping alone since. I've always loved camping. The escape from city noise, the fresh air, and the open sky full of stars all brought me a sense of peace. This time, I decided to camp solo. I'd done it before without any problems. I'd hike deep into the wilderness, pitch my tent far from any trail, and enjoy the solitude. It was the perfect way to clear my head. But this trip was different. It's a trip I'll never forget. I chose a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains. The region was known for its beauty and the variety of trails. I spent hours studying maps, picking out a spot that was far enough off the beaten path to guarantee isolation. I wanted quiet, just me and nature. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, which, looking back, was my first mistake. The hike to my chosen site was tough. The trail was uneven, the incline steep in places. I carried a heavy backpack with all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, and some basic tools. It was mid-autumn, and the crisp air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. The trees were a mix of fiery reds, oranges, and yellows. It was beautiful, but I was too focused on the hike to fully appreciate it. After about 5 hours, I found the perfect spot. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense woods. A narrow stream trickled nearby, its water crystal clear. I set up my tent and unpacked my gear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as I prepared a simple dinner of instant noodles and jerky. Sitting by the stream, I ate while listening to the forest. The rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, and the babbling water were the only sounds. It was exactly what I wanted. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and read a book by flashlight. The forest outside my tent was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Owls hooted, and I heard the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I fell asleep easily, feeling safe and content. The first night passed without incident. The next day, I spent my time exploring the area. I hiked up a nearby ridge, taking in the stunning views of the valley below. I found a cluster of wild mushrooms and took photos to identify them later. I even spotted a deer drinking from the stream, its ears twitching at every sound. It was a perfect day. That evening, as I was boiling water for tea, I noticed something odd. A small pile of sticks and rocks had appeared near my tent. I hadn't put them there. At first, I thought maybe I'd accidentally kicked them into that arrangement, but it looked too deliberate. The sticks were stacked neatly, and the rocks were arranged in a circle. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence. The second night was colder. I woke up several times, shivering despite my warm sleeping bag. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my tent. They were faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the stream. I told myself it was probably just an animal and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found another pile of sticks and rocks, this time right next to my tent. The arrangement was different, almost like a crude symbol. My stomach tightened. This wasn't something I could ignore. Someone had to be out there. Someone was messing with me. I scanned the area but saw no one. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt wrong. I decided to pack up and move to a different spot. I didn't want to cut my trip short, but I also didn't want to stay there. After hiking for a couple of hours, I found another clearing. It wasn't as picturesque as the first spot, but it felt safer. I set up my tent and tried to shake off the unease. I told myself I was overreacting, that the piles of sticks and rocks were probably some kind of prank by another camper. Still, I couldn't fully relax. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my tent made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and definitely human. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, clutching my pocket knife. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. The next morning, I found fresh boot prints in the dirt around my tent. They were large, much larger than my own feet. My hands shook as I packed up my gear. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to my car. The isolation that I had once found so appealing now felt dangerous. The hike back was grueling. Every snap of a twig made me whip around, expecting to see someone behind me. I didn't, but the feeling of being watched never left. By the time I reached my car, it was late afternoon. I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But the road remained empty. When I got home, I checked all my doors and windows, making sure they were locked. I couldn't stop thinking about the piles of sticks and rocks, the footsteps, the boot prints. Who had been out there with me? What did they want? Weeks passed, but the experience stayed with me. I started having nightmares about the forest, about being chased by someone I couldn't see. I haven't gone camping since. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, now feels like a place of danger. I've tried to move on, but part of me knows I'll never have the answers I need. Whoever was out there, there's still a mystery, and that's what scares me the most. I didn't plan for the trip to go wrong. I've been camping dozens of times, not as an expert, but enough to know what I was doing. This time, I'd picked a remote spot up in the mountains, the kind of place where the air smells cleaner, the trees grow denser, and the only noise is the sound of the wind brushing through the pines. I wanted peace. I wanted to disconnect from everything for a while. I drove out early, my car loaded with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, a portable stove, a good knife, water purification tablets, and even a first aid kit. I wasn't going to take any chances. The drive was long but scenic, with winding roads that climbed higher and higher into the wilderness. I eventually reached the trailhead, parked the car, and strapped on my backpack. The trail stretched ahead of me, promising solitude and beauty. The hike to my chosen campsite was about 6 miles. The trail wasn't well marked, but I'd studied the map and brought a GPS. I knew how to read the terrain and navigate, so I wasn't worried. The first few miles were easy, the path wide and clear, surrounded by towering trees and patches of sunlight. But as I got further in, the trail became narrower, the forest thicker. I had to step over roots and duck under low-hanging branches. Felt like I was leaving the world behind. By the time I reached the spot, I was sweating and tired but satisfied. The site was perfect. A small clearing nestled among the trees, with a stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started gathering wood for a fire. The sun was still high, so I took my time. There was no rush out here. The quiet was almost overwhelming, broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. As the evening settled in, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. The smell of the food mixed with the pine-scented air, and for a while I felt completely at peace. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, and thought about how disconnected I'd been lately. Work, social media, endless notifications. None of that mattered out here. When darkness fully enveloped the forest, the mood shifted. I'd always loved the night, but out here, away from the comforting hum of civilization, it felt different. The blackness was so absolute that even with the fire burning, I couldn't see more than a few feet into the trees. The sounds of the forest grew louder, crickets chirping, the occasional snap of a twig. Normal noises, I told myself, just nature doing its thing. But then I heard something that wasn't normal. A low, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not the random scuffle of a small animal, but the weighty sound of something or someone stepping carefully. My muscles tensed. I'd been so focused on the peacefulness of the place that I hadn't considered the possibility of someone else being out here. It was supposed to be remote, hard to reach. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and undergrowth, but nothing moved. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other wildlife. After all, this was their home, not mine. Eventually, I climbed into the tent, zipped it up, and settled into my sleeping bag. The fire outside burned low, casting flickering shadows against the tent walls. I tried to sleep, but my ears stayed alert, picking up every little noise. It took hours before exhaustion finally dragged me under. When I woke, it was still dark. At first, I wasn't sure why I'd woken up. Then I heard it again, the crunch of leaves, closer this time. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear. The sound came again, deliberate and slow. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't trying to hide. My mind raced through possibilities. Another camper? A hunter? Or something worse? I reached for the knife I'd placed next to me before going to sleep. My fingers closed around the handle, the weight of it both reassuring and terrifying. I'd never had to use it for anything other than cutting rope or preparing food. The sound stopped, and the silence was worse. I wanted to believe they'd left, but I couldn't be sure. Minutes dragged by like hours as I lay there, clutching the knife and listening to the oppressive quiet. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire had gone out completely, leaving only a pile of cold ashes. The forest looked different in the morning light, less menacing but still unsettling. I walked the perimeter of my campsite, searching for signs of whoever had been out there. I found footprints in the dirt, large and unmistakably human. They circled the tent, then trailed off into the woods. I tried to convince myself it was just another camper passing through, but the placement of the footprints, so close to my tent, felt wrong. I decided I'd had enough. Solitude was one thing, but this was something else. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. The hike back to the car felt longer than the hike in. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept checking the GPS to make sure I was on the right path, but the forest seemed different, like it had shifted overnight. The trees felt closer, the shadows deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. About halfway back, I found something that stopped me cold. A piece of fabric caught on a branch, the same color as the shirt I'd been wearing the day before. It didn't make sense. I hadn't been anywhere near this part of the trail. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but none of them made sense. The only conclusion I could reach was that someone had been following me, watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I pushed on, moving as quickly as I could without losing the trail. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. The sense of urgency overpowered everything else. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack into the trunk and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. My hands trembled as I started the engine. The drive down the mountain was a blur. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees and onto the road. But there was nothing, just the empty forest receding behind me. When I reached the nearest town, I pulled into a gas station and sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm down. The feeling of being watched still lingered, like a weight pressing on my chest. I never reported what happened. What could I say? That I'd heard noises and found footprints? That someone might have followed me? It wasn't enough to go on. But I haven't been camping since. The thought of being out there, alone and vulnerable, is too much. I wanted peace, and I found something else entirely. Something that still haunts me every time I close my eyes.